back. Before we dive in, take a deep breath and let the stress of the day melt away. I'm really glad you're here, and I'd love to get to know you better. So if you had to choose, what would be your favourite food? Let me know in the comments. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And enjoy. 17-year-old Jace Morales has always been drawn to the forgotten corners of the digital world. While his classmates in suburban California spend their nights gaming or scrolling through social media, Jace haunts abandoned servers and explores the deep recesses of networks that most people forgot existed decades ago. He calls it digital archaeology, hunting through corrupted files, broken databases, and obsolete systems for fragments of the past that somehow survived in the electronic void. His bedroom is a shrine to outdated technology, vintage computers, jury-rigged hard drives, and monitors that flicker with the ghostly light of data streams most people will never see. On this particular October night, the rain hammers against his window as Jace navigates through a particularly interesting discovery, an old US military server from the 1940s that somehow remained active, buried deep within layers of bureaucratic digital sediment. The server is a relic, its architecture so ancient that accessing it requires tools Jace had to code himself. Most of the files are corrupted beyond repair, fragmentary records of supply shipments and personnel transfers that tell the mundane story of wartime logistics. But then he finds it, a single file, labelled only glans.src, hidden in a directory that shouldn't exist according to any filing system he knows. The file is heavily encrypted, its binary structure unlike anything in Jace's considerable experience. It pulses with an almost organic rhythm when he runs it through his visualization software, creating a three-dimensional waveform that seems to shift and breathe on his screen. The pattern is hypnotic, complex beyond anything that should have existed in the 1940s, yet the timestamps are authentic. He's verified them against 3 different historical databases. As he works to decode the binary, aligning the waveform patterns and adjusting the frequency modulations, his equipment begins to behave strangely. His monitors flicker, his hard drives whir with unusual intensity, and the temperature in his room drops noticeably. The breakthrough comes at 3:17 a.m. when Jace finally manages to synchronize the waveform patterns. The moment the alignment completes, his world explodes in white light. Every electronic device in his room simultaneously overloads, screens blazing with impossible brightness before going dark. The electromagnetic pulse hits him like a physical blow, and consciousness abandons him as he collapses across his keyboard. When awareness returns, everything is wrong. The familiar weight of his gaming chair is gone, replaced by cold concrete and rubble that cuts into his palms as he pushes himself upright. His ears ring with a high-pitched whine that makes thinking difficult, and the air tastes of smoke, cordite, and something metallic that might be blood. The night sky above him burns red with reflected flames, and the sound of sirens wails in the distance, not the electronic warble of modern emergency vehicles, but the mechanical rise and fall of air raid warnings. Before Jace can fully process what's happening, rough hands grab him from behind. A voice barks commands in harsh German, and when he turns, he faces a figure that belongs in a history textbook, a Wehrmacht soldier, his uniform authentic down to the last button, his eyes hard with the paranoia of a city under siege. The soldier's weapon is real, his suspicion genuine, and when Jace stammers in English, those eyes narrow with dangerous interest. Escape comes through luck and confusion rather than skill. An explosion rocks the nearby building, showering them both with debris, and in the chaos, Jace runs. He stumbles through streets that look like the aftermath of an apocalypse, past buildings reduced to skeletal frames and cratered roads that speak of months of bombardment. The architecture is unmistakably European, unmistakably wartime, and unmistakably real. This isn't a movie set or a historical reenactment. This is Berlin in 1945, and somehow, impossibly, he's actually here. In a bombed-out apartment building, Jace finds temporary shelter and time to think. His modern clothes mark him as an outsider, his smartphone is useless dead weight, and his accent will betray him to anyone who hears it. The historical implications overwhelm him. He's read enough to know that Berlin in early 1945 was a death trap, caught between the collapsing Nazi regime and the advancing Soviet forces. Civilians died by the thousands, either from bombardment, execution, or simple starvation. He has no identification, no explanation for his presence, and no idea how to survive in a world where the wrong word or gesture can mean death. His first real human contact comes 3 days later, when hunger finally drives him from his hiding place. He's attempting to scavenge food from a ruined grocery store when voices approach. German, but speaking in the rapid, coded phrases of people who have something to hide. 2 figures emerge from the shadows. A young woman about his own age with blonde hair darkened by dirt and sharp blue eyes that miss nothing, and an older boy whose resemblance to her suggests a sibling relationship. Both carry themselves with the cautious alertness of people who have learned that survival depends on constant vigilance. The girl introduces herself as Lenny Fisher, her brother as Karl. They're part of an underground network that helps civilians escape Berlin before the city falls completely, though their motivations are complex, part humanitarian, part practical, and part driven by a desire to salvage something meaningful from the ruins of their world. When Jace claims to be a Belgian refugee separated from his group, they're sceptical but not hostile. His story has holes, but Berlin in 1945 is full of displaced people with incomplete histories and questionable papers. Working with the resistance exposes Jace to the brutal realities of wartime that no history book could fully convey. He witnesses public executions of suspected deserters, huddled in basements during air raids that shake dust from the walls and terror from the survivors, and sees the casual cruelty that desperation breeds in good people pushed beyond their limits. The moral landscape is more complex than his modern perspective prepared him for. Some resistance members are heroes, others are criminals taking advantage of chaos, and most are simply people trying to survive in circumstances that offer no good choices. The revelation comes when Karl leads a raid on a Nazi administrative building, seeking blank identification papers that could save dozens of civilian lives. In the chaos of the operation, Jace finds himself in an archive room filled with classified documents. Among them, he discovers blueprints for something called Project Glanzschleifer, a temporal research program that seems to have been attempting to weaponize exotic matter to create rifts in space-time. The documentation is fragmentary, but describes experiments conducted beneath the Reichstag using technology that shouldn't have existed for decades. Most disturbing are the warnings about side effects. Prolonged exposure to temporal fields can cause chronological fracturing, where a person's timeline begins to diverge and split. The implications hit him like a physical blow. This project created the rift that brought him here, and the file he found in 2025 was somehow connected to these experiments. But the documents also reveal a terrifying possibility. The longer he remains in 1945, the more unstable his connection to his original timeline becomes. He's already been here for 2 weeks, and according to the Nazi research, that puts him dangerously close to a point of no return. Time becomes his enemy in ways beyond the historical. Allied forces are advancing on Berlin from all sides, with Soviet troops expected to reach the city centre within days. If Jace is going to return to his own time, he needs to access the rift core supposedly hidden beneath the Reichstag. But that facility is guarded by the Eisenkorps, an elite SS unit fanatically devoted to protecting the Reich's most sensitive secrets. Meanwhile, his growing attachment to Lenny and Karl complicates everything. These aren't historical figures to him anymore. They're friends who have saved his life multiple times and who trust him with their own. The dilemma becomes acute when Karl is captured during a routine supply run. The Gestapo has been systematically rounding up resistance members, and Karl's interrogation will likely expose the entire network. Lenny begs Jace to help plan a rescue, but he knows that any delay reduces his chances of returning home. The moral weight is crushing. Save his friend and potentially doom himself to a life in the wrong century, or abandon the people who showed him kindness in his darkest hour. His decision surprises him. Perhaps it's the weeks of witnessing both the worst and best of humanity, or perhaps it's simply that he's become a different person than the isolated teenager who spent his nights alone with computers. Either way, he chooses to help rescue Karl, even knowing the cost. The infiltration of the Reichstag complex is a nightmare of timing, luck, and desperate improvisation. Berlin is collapsing around them. Soviet artillery pounds the government district. Fires rage unchecked through entire neighbourhoods, and the streets are choked with refugees fleeing toward imaginary safety. Jace and Lenny navigate through drainage tunnels and bomb craters, following intelligence provided by other resistance members who paid for the information with their lives. The rift facility exists, hidden in sub-level basements that predate the building above them. The The chamber itself is both beautiful and terrifying. A crystalline structure the size of a small aircraft hangar, filled with technology that seems to blend 1940s engineering with principles that won't be discovered for decades. Energy patterns dance through translucent walls, and the air itself seems to vibrate with barely contained power. At the centre stands Dr. Heinrich Glantz, the project's architect, now gaunt and clearly dying from radiation exposure but still obsessively tending to his creation. Glantz believes his work will save the Reich by allowing them to rewrite history itself, correcting the mistakes that led to Germany's defeat. His madness is both tragic and terrifying, a brilliant mind broken by the weight of a collapsing ideology and the consequences of his own hubris. But he's also the key to Jace's return, because the rift can only be properly calibrated using the original temporal signature that brought Jace here in the first place. The solution is elegant in its simplicity and terrible in its implications. The memory chip from Jace's smartphone, damaged but not destroyed by the electromagnetic pulse, contains fragments of the original waveform he decoded. Combined with the rift's crystalline matrix, it can create a stable pathway back to 2025. But the process requires manual calibration from within the chamber itself, and the energy fields will kill anyone who remains to maintain the connection. As Soviet forces breach the building above them, and the sound of gunfire echoes down the stairwells, Jace faces his final choice. Lenny volunteers to stay behind, arguing that she belongs in this time while he belongs in the future. But Jace has learned something about responsibility and sacrifice from these people, who accepted him despite his lies and strangeness. Instead of allowing her sacrifice, he creates a timed relay system, using both the smartphone components and the rift's own crystal matrix, providing just enough time for both of them to escape, while maintaining the signal long enough for his passage. Their goodbye is brief but profound. In the collapsing chamber, with the sounds of battle growing closer, Lenny asks if people in the future will remember what happened here, if any of it mattered. Jace promises that it does, that the courage she and others showed in the darkest times becomes the foundation for everything good that follows. She smiles then, and for a moment the weight of the war seems to lift from her shoulders. The return passage is violent and disorienting, reality stretching and compressing around him as the rift collapses. He experiences moments from multiple timelines simultaneously, versions where he never returned, where he died in Berlin, where the war ended differently. But the relay holds just long enough, and consciousness returns to find him in his bedroom, sunlight streaming through familiar windows. Everything appears normal. His room is unchanged, the frayed computers exactly where he left them, but subtle differences suggest that his journey has created ripples. A photograph on his wall shows him with a blonde girl in 1940s clothing, the image aged and yellowed as if it had been there for decades. His phone, despite being damaged, contains a voice memo in his own voice. You did it, but not all of you made it back. The most disturbing discovery comes when he examines his surviving hard drives. New files have appeared, and possibly old but dated after his return. One is an audio recording labelled lennymessage.wev, and when he plays it, her voice fills his room across the decades. Tell them we tried to be more than what history made us. Tell them we mattered. The message is accompanied by text files containing information about resistance operations, names of people who should have been forgotten, and details about Karl's eventual fate. He survived the war and spent his life helping displaced persons find their families. The implications are staggering. Somehow his presence in 1945 created a connection that transcends normal temporal boundaries. He carries with him not just memories but actual evidence of people and events that history forgot or never properly recorded. The responsibility is overwhelming. He is now the keeper of stories that would otherwise be lost, the guardian of voices that would otherwise remain silent. As he sits in his unchanged room, staring at photographs that shouldn't exist, and listening to messages from the dead, Jace realizes that his journey has only begun. He may have returned to his own time, but part of him remains forever in that burning city, forever connected to the people who showed him what courage looks like when everything else has been stripped away. The question that haunts him now is not whether he can forget what he experienced, but whether he has the strength to honour it. In a world that often seems to have forgotten the lessons of history, he carries the weight of memory and the obligation to ensure that their sacrifices continue to matter. The weeks that follow his return are a study in adaptation and haunting. Jace attempts to resume his normal life, but everything feels fundamentally altered. School becomes an exercise in pretending to care about algebra and literature when he has witnessed the collapse of an empire and held the hands of dying children in bomb shelters. His classmates complain about pop quizzes and cafeteria food, while he remembers the taste of sawdust bread and the sound of artillery growing closer each night. The disconnect is so profound that he wonders if this is what soldiers feel when they return from war, this sense of living in two worlds simultaneously, with one foot in each timeline. His relationship with technology has changed as well. The computers and devices that once fascinated him now seem primitive compared to the temporal manipulation he witnessed beneath the Reichstag. Yet they also carry a new significance, serving as bridges between past and present. He becomes obsessed with documenting everything he remembers, creating detailed files about the resistance network, maps of Berlin's underground passages, and profiles of every person he encountered. The work feels sacred, a duty to preserve lives that would otherwise fade into historical anonymity. The hardest part is the isolation. How do you explain to anyone that you've lived through one of history's darkest chapters, that you've made life and death decisions alongside teenagers who never lived to see 20? His parents notice his changed behaviour, the way he flinches at sudden noises, his new appreciation for simple meals, his tendency to hoard non-perishable food in his room, but they attribute it to typical adolescent moodiness. Friends drift away as Jace struggles to maintain interest in their concerns, and teachers grow frustrated with his distracted performance in classes that once came easily to him. But the files on his computer continue to multiply. Sometimes he finds new documents that he didn't create, records that seem to generate themselves from the quantum echoes of his temporal displacement. A diary entry from a resistance member he never met, coordinates for safe houses that helped hundreds escape the city, photographs of Berlin's reconstruction that show faces he recognises, Lenny and Carl, older but unmistakable, working to rebuild what the war destroyed. These fragments of alternate history suggest that his presence in 1945 created ripples far beyond what he witnessed directly. The most significant discovery comes 3 months after his return, when a new folder appears on his desktop labelled The Glantz Files. Inside are documents that suggest the temporal experiment didn't end with the fall of Berlin. Dr. Glanz's research was apparently recovered by both American and Soviet forces, leading to classified programs that continued the work in secret. The files describe other rifts, other temporal displacements, and other individuals who found themselves torn from their proper time and struggling to find their way home. Jace realises he may not be alone in his experience. Somewhere in the world, there might be others who carry the same burden of displaced memory and impossible knowledge. This revelation transforms his sense of purpose. Instead of viewing his experience as an isolated incident, he begins to understand it as part of a larger pattern of temporal instability created by humanity's attempts to weaponize time itself. The responsibility feels overwhelming but also clarifying. If there are others like him, they need to find each other. If the rifts are still opening, someone needs to document the pattern and find a way to prevent future displacements. And if the past continues to reach into the present through quantum echoes and temporal fragments, then someone needs to serve as a guardian of those connections. He starts a blog under a pseudonym, carefully disguised as fiction but containing enough accurate details to serve as a beacon for anyone who might have experienced similar displacement. The stories he tells are presented as alternate history and speculative fiction, but every detail comes from lived experience. He describes the taste of ersatz coffee, the sound of Soviet rockets, the way hope and despair could coexist in the same breath. Slowly, responses begin to arrive. Most are from history enthusiasts impressed by his research, but others carry a different tone. Comments that ask pointed questions about details no historian would know. Messages that reference experiences similar to his own. The first direct contact comes from someone calling themselves Temporal Drift 47, who sends a private message describing their own displacement to the American Civil War. The details are too specific, too visceral to be imagination. A second contact follows, a woman who found herself in 1960s Prague during the Soviet invasion. Then others, a businessman who lived through the London Blitz, a college student who witnessed the French Revolution, a child who experienced the final days of Pompeii. Each story is different, but all share common elements. the electromagnetic pulse that triggered their displacement, the struggle to survive in an alien time, and the partial return that left them changed and haunted by memories that officially never happened. Together they begin to map the pattern. The displacements aren't random. They're drawn to moments of historical crisis, times when the fabric of reality was already stretched thin by violence and upheaval. The rifts seem to feed on temporal stress, opening most readily during wars, revolutions, and catastrophic events. More disturbing is the discovery that the frequency of displacements is increasing. What began as isolated incidents in the 1940s has accelerated dramatically in recent decades, suggesting that the damage to spacetime is compounding. Their informal network grows into something more organised, a support group for the temporally displaced, a research collective investigating the phenomenon, and a warning system for others who might stumble across the same dangers that change their lives. They call themselves the Ember Collective, named for the way their experiences burn like dying coals in the darkness of forgotten history. Each member contributes their expertise. The Civil War survivor becomes their expert on 19th century American politics. The Prague Witness documents Eastern European resistance movements, and Jace serves as their technology specialist and coordinator. The work is both healing and heartbreaking. Sharing their experiences with others who understand helps ease the isolation that haunts all of them, but it also reinforces the magnitude of what they've lost. They are living bridges between past and present, carrying knowledge and relationships that exist in quantum superposition, real to them but invisible to everyone else. The weight of that responsibility shapes every decision they make, every story they choose to preserve or let fade. As the collective grows, they discover that their temporal experiences have left them with more than just memories. Each member shows signs of enhanced pattern recognition, an almost supernatural ability to sense historical significance and predict social trends. Some develop limited precognitive abilities, while others can perceive emotional imprints left by traumatic events. Jace finds that his connection to digital systems has deepened. He can intuitively understand complex algorithms and interface with technology in ways that seem almost telepathic. These abilities come with a cost. The temporal displacement has left all of them slightly unstuck from linear time, experiencing moments of déjà vu, prophetic dreams, and periodic flashes of alternate timelines. They age more slowly than they should, as if their partial existence outside normal spacetime has diluted the passage of years. Medical tests reveal cellular anomalies that doctors can't explain, and several members report that they no longer appear properly in photographs or video recordings. Their images are slightly transparent, as if reality itself recognizes their displaced nature. The most profound change in Jace comes through his ongoing connection to Lenny. What began as impossible audio files has evolved into something deeper. Brief moments of temporal overlap where he can perceive her experiences across the decades. He witnesses her life after the war, her work with displaced persons, her marriage to a fellow resistance member, the children she raised with stories of courage and hope. He sees her grow old with dignity and purpose, always carrying the memory of the strange American boy who appeared in Berlin's darkest hour and then vanished like a dream. These visions reveal the true scope of his impact on history. The resistance network he helped preserve went on to assist thousands of refugees in the post-war period. Carl's survival led to the creation of one of Europe's most effective aid organisations. Lenny's children became doctors, teachers, and social workers, carrying forward the values their mother learned from people who refused to let circumstances define their humanity. The ripples of his presence spread across generations, creating a legacy of compassion that touches lives he will never know. But the visions also show him the danger of temporal instability. He witnesses alternate timelines where his presence in 1945 led to different outcomes, some better, some catastrophically worse. In one timeline, his knowledge of future events allows the resistance to prevent key Nazi officials from escaping, fundamentally altering the post-war world. In another, his interference creates a paradox that unravels causality itself, leaving reality fractured and bleeding. The responsibility of wielding temporal power becomes clear. Every action across time carries consequences that ripple through history in ways impossible to predict or control. This understanding shapes the collective's mission, as they mature from a support group into something approaching a secret guardian organisation. They work to identify and contain temporal rifts before they can displace others, using their enhanced abilities to detect the quantum signatures that precede temporal instability. They also serve as counsellors for new displacement victims, helping them adapt to their changed circumstances and integrate their experiences into productive lives. The work is dangerous and often heartbreaking. They arrive too late to prevent some displacements, finding only the confused and traumatised aftermath of temporal accidents. Others refuse their help, preferring to believe their experiences were hallucinations rather than face the implications of temporal displacement. Some members of the collective are lost to temporal storms, cascade events where multiple timelines collapse into each other, creating zones of chaos where causality itself breaks down. Yet they persist, driven by the knowledge that they are the only ones who truly understand what's happening. Government agencies exist that investigate temporal anomalies, but their approaches are crude and often counterproductive. Military applications of temporal technology create more problems than they solve, while academic researchers lack the experiential knowledge necessary to understand the human cost of temporal displacement. The collective operates in the shadows, using their unique abilities to protect both history and the individuals caught in its crossfire. They maintain safe houses for displaced persons, provide emotional support for those struggling with temporal trauma, and work to preserve the stories that would otherwise be lost to the gaps between timelines. Their motto, suggested by Lenny's message, becomes, "Tell them we mattered," a commitment to ensuring that no life touched by temporal displacement is forgotten or dismissed. As years pass, Jace grows into his role as the collective's coordinator and archivist. His bedroom becomes a command centre filled with quantum computers that exist partially outside normal space-time, allowing him to monitor temporal fluctuations across the globe. The walls are covered with photographs and documents from dozens of different time periods, creating a visual timeline that spans millennia of human experience. But late at night, when the monitoring systems are quiet and the rest of the world sleeps, he still returns to those first audio files from Lenny. Her voice, preserved across decades by quantum entanglement and temporal paradox, reminds him why this work matters. She speaks not just for herself, but for everyone who ever faced impossible circumstances and chose to respond with courage rather than despair. Her words echo across time. Tell them we tried to be more than what history made us. Tell them we mattered. And in his quiet room, surrounded by the artifacts of impossible journeys and the weight of temporal responsibility, Jace continues to tell their stories. He preserves the voices of the displaced, documents the courage of the forgotten, and maintains the connections that bind past and future together. The Ember Rift has closed, but its echoes ripple through time itself, connecting a lonely teenager with the heroes he never knew he needed to meet. And in that connection lies both the burden and the hope of remembering that even in the darkest times people can choose to be more than what circumstances demand, and that their choices echo across the years to inspire others who have not yet been born. The past and future are bound together by the choices made in moments of crisis, and Jace now understands that he is part of that eternal conversation between what was, what is, and what might yet be. The tour guide's voice droned on about pottery shards and bull-leaping frescoes. But Theo Anastos had stopped listening 20 minutes ago. He pressed record on his pocket device and held it low, capturing the ambient symphony of 40 American teenagers shuffling through the ruins of Knossos. Their sneakers squeaked against ancient stone, backpack zippers jingled, and someone's phone buzzed with notifications from a world 3,000 miles away. "Sound is the memory of space," Theo whispered into the recorder, then clicked it off. At 17, he had already filled dozens of memory cards with what he called sonic archaeology, the invisible history that lived in echoes, reverb, and the spaces between sounds. His classmates thought he was weird, his teachers thought he was distracted, his parents thought he was going through a phase. Maybe they were all right. The October sun beat down on the reconstructed columns of the ancient palace, and Theo squinted through his thick-rimmed glasses at the tour group ahead. This trip to Greece was supposed to connect him to his heritage, to make him feel Greek-American instead of just American who happened to have a Greek last name. Instead, he felt more displaced than ever. The ruins looked like a theme park version of history, all clean lines and tourist-friendly pathways where something wild and dangerous had once lived. He wandered toward the edge of the site, following a strange acoustic phenomenon he'd noticed. An echo that seemed to come from underground, bouncing off surfaces that shouldn't exist. The tour guide was explaining the myth of the Minotaur now, her voice carrying on the wind, but Theo was more interested in the way sound behaved near a particular section of weathered stone. There, partially hidden by overgrown brush and marked with a rusted sign in 3 languages, was an entrance he hadn't seen on any of the site maps. The opening was sealed with modern concrete, but age and weather had created gaps large enough for a determined teenager to squeeze through. Strange symbols were carved into the stone archway above, not the reconstructed linear B script from the museum displays, but something older, sharper, more urgent. Theo checked his recorder's battery level and slipped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, and his breath formed small puffs in the suddenly frigid air. More unsettling was what happened to sound itself. His footsteps didn't just echo, they layered and looped, creating a polyrhythmic pattern that seemed to follow its own logic. When he whispered, "hello," the word came back to him twisted, stretched, sometimes multiplied into a chorus of hellos that faded at different rates. The tunnel sloped downward, and Theo followed it with one hand trailing along the wall for guidance. The stone was smooth, almost organic, carved with spiralling patterns that his fingers could trace even in the darkness. After what felt like hundreds of yards, the passage opened into a larger space. Theo fumbled for his phone's flashlight and gasped. He was standing at the edge of a vast underground chamber, carved from living rock and decorated with frescoes that made the museum pieces look like children's drawings. Bulls danced across the walls in impossible colours, their eyes seeming to track his movement. Priestesses raised their arms towards ceiling paintings of stars arranged in constellations he didn't recognise, and everywhere, spiralling deeper into the bedrock, were passages that branched and twisted like the inside of a shell. This was the real labyrinth. Theo raised his recorder and spoke softly. Day 3 of the grease trip. "I think I just found something that isn't supposed to exist." He paused, listening to the way his voice scattered through the chambers ahead. "The acoustic properties here are impossible. It's like the architecture was designed specifically for sound manipulation." That's when he heard it. His own voice, played back at him from somewhere deeper in the maze. Day 3 of the grease trip. But he'd just spoken those words. The echo should have faded by now. "I think I just found something that isn't supposed to exist." Theo's hands trembled as he followed the sound of his own voice deeper into the tunnels. The walls pressed closer together, covered in linear inscriptions and spiral carvings that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. His phone's battery was draining faster than it should, and twice he could have sworn he saw his flashlight beam reflecting off surfaces that weren't there when he turned toward them. The passage ended at a stone archway covered in the same spiralling patterns he'd been seeing, but these were deeper, more intricate, almost hypnotic. As he stepped through, the air around him seemed to compress and expand at the same time. A wave of silence so complete it felt physical washed over him, and Theo's world went black. He woke to the sound of drums, not the tinny electronic beats from someone's playlist, but deep resonant percussion that seemed to come from the earth itself. Theo sat up, his head spinning, and realised he was lying on a stone floor under an open sky. But this wasn't the Mediterranean sky he'd seen that afternoon. This was a night sky without any light pollution whatsoever, so dense with stars that they cast actual shadows. The air smelled different too. Wood smoke and incense and something else, something alive and wild that made the hair on his arm stand up. The drumming continued, echoing from somewhere above, and Theo realised he was still underground. The sky was an opening in the cavern ceiling, and torchlight flickered from passages that led upward toward the surface. This was still the labyrinth, but it was alive now, inhabited. Theo stood on shaking legs and checked his equipment. The recorder was still warm in his pocket, and when he checked the display it showed 6 hours of recorded material. But he'd only been conscious for minutes before he'd blacked out. Unless... He pressed play on the most recent file. His own voice whispered back at him, "The walls are moving when I'm not looking. I can hear people in the distance, but their voices sound wrong, like they're speaking underwater. I think I'm not in the same time anymore." Theo had no memory of recording those words. A sound made him spin around, footsteps, light and quick, echoing from one of the passages. A girl about his own age emerged from the shadows, dressed in clothing that looked hand-woven and practical rather than fashionable. Her dark hair was tied back with leather cords, and she moved with the careful alertness of someone who'd learned not to trust her environment. "You're new," she said in accented English. New arrivals always look like that, like they've seen a ghost. Where am I? Theo's voice cracked. When am I? The girl studied him with sharp, intelligent eyes. The same place you were before. As for when, she shrugged. Time moves strangely in the labyrinth. I'm Alea. I've been here for a while, long enough to learn which passages sing and which ones lie. Passages that sing. Alea gestured for him to follow her toward one of the tunnel mouths. As they approached, Theo heard it, a low, almost subsonic humming that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. When Alea placed her palm against the wall, the humming shifted in pitch and rhythm. The safe paths make music, she explained. The dangerous ones stay silent, or they echo back sounds that haven't happened yet. I survived by learning to listen. Survived what? Her expression darkened. The same thing all the sacrifices are supposed to survive. The Minotaur. They walked through passages that defied logic, corridors that curved back on themselves, and chambers that were larger inside than their entrances suggested. Alea moved with confidence, pausing at intersections to listen for the telltale humming of safe paths. She explained that she'd been cast into the labyrinth from her village as an offering to appease the bull god, but the reality was more complex than the myth suggested. There is no monster with a bull's head, she told him, as they navigated a section where the walls were covered in bronze mirrors that reflected no light. The Minotaur is a man in a ritual mask, a priest-executioner who knows these tunnels better than anyone. He uses the acoustic properties to hunt. He can throw his voice, make it seem like you're calling from behind you when he's actually ahead. Many of the sacrifices panic and run toward the sound of their own names being called. Theo paused to record her explanation, fascinated despite his fear. How long have you been here? I mean, in your time? 3 seasons, Alea replied, counting on her fingers. But I've learned that seasons mean nothing in the labyrinth. I've met people who claim they've been here for decades, and others who insist they only arrived yesterday, even though I watched them stumble through the entrance during my first week. As they walked, she taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated which passages were safe. The singing stones were only the most obvious marker. There were others, the way shadows fell at certain angles, revealing hidden symbols carved into the rock, the temperature variations that indicated airflow from passages that led upward toward escape, rather than deeper into the maze, the faint phosphorescent moss that grew only in chambers where the acoustic resonance was stable. The builders were brilliant, Alea continued, running her hand along a wall covered in intricate spiral carvings. They understood that sound doesn't just move through space, it shapes it. These spirals aren't just decorative, they're waveguides, designed to channel and amplify specific frequencies while dampening others. The entire labyrinth is one enormous musical instrument, and we're the notes being played. Theo held up his recorder, capturing the ambient sound of their footsteps echoing through the corridor. In my time, we call people like you acousticians, sound engineers, the science of how sound behaves in different environments. Science, Alea repeated the unfamiliar word slowly. Is that what you call magic in your time? The question hung in the air as they entered a vast chamber dominated by what looked like a massive stone organ. Pipes of varying sizes jutted from the walls and ceiling, all connected to a central console covered in symbols that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when viewed directly. The air thrummed with subsonic vibrations that Theo could feel in his bones. This is where they tested their theories, Alea whispered, where they learned to bend space and time through sound. I've heard the echoes of their experiments, voices from the past arguing about frequencies and harmonics, celebrating discoveries that would reshape reality itself. She showed him how to approach the console safely, stepping only on specific stones that hummed in harmony with each other. When she pressed her palm against the central symbol, the entire organ came to life with a sound so complex and beautiful that Theo found himself crying without knowing why. Each pipe connects to a different part of the labyrinth, she explained over the music. Different chambers, different passages, different points in time. The priest could send messages across centuries, coordinate rituals between past and future, even speak with the dead. Or with people who hadn't been born yet, Theo added, thinking of his own voice warning them about the recordings. The organ song faded, but its echoes continued to bounce through the chamber for minutes afterward, creating an ever-shifting tapestry of harmonics. Theo recorded every second, knowing instinctively that this sound might be the key to understanding everything. Theo shivered and instinctively checked his recorder. still running, still collecting sounds that might be their only way out. They entered a circular chamber where the ceiling was carved with constellation maps, and Alea showed him something that made his understanding of the world tilt sideways. She whispered a specific phrase, what sounded like linear A script, toward the eastern wall, and a hidden panel slid aside to reveal another passage. The labyrinth responds to sound, she said. Specific tones, specific words, specific rhythms. It's not just a prison or a trap, it's a machine. A machine for what? For manipulating space and time through acoustic resonance. The builders weren't just architects, they were sound engineers. Every chamber is tuned to specific frequencies. The spirals carved into the walls aren't just decoration, they're waveguides. Theo thought about his own obsession with sound, his hours spent recording and analysing ambient audio. He pulled out his device and played back one of his recordings from the modern cave entrance, the one where he'd whispered hello into the darkness. The reaction was immediate. The wall in front of them shimmered like water and rotated 90 degrees, revealing a passage that hadn't been there moments before. "Your magic box," Alea breathed, staring at the recorder with a mixture of fear and fascination. "It captures voices and plays them back. It's not magic. It's just technology." But even as he said it, Theo wondered if the distinction mattered in a place like this. They pressed deeper into the maze, Theo recording every step while Alea guided them through the singing passages. The recorder's memory was nearly full, but he couldn't bring himself to delete anything. Every sound might be crucial to their escape, or to someone else's rescue years in the future. As they walked, he began to understand the true sophistication of the labyrinth's design. It wasn't just that the walls moved, or that time flowed differently. The entire structure was a living database of sound, storing and replaying acoustic information across centuries. In one chamber, they heard the faint echo of Linear A being spoken by its original users, the words ghostly but unmistakably authentic. In another, they caught fragments of conversations in languages that wouldn't be invented for thousands of years. The labyrinth collects sounds, Theo realised, speaking into his recorder, as they navigated a corridor lined with crystalline formations that chimed softly when disturbed. It's not just a prison or a temple, it's an archive, a library of every sound that's ever been made within its walls. Alea nodded grimly. And some sounds that haven't been made yet. That's how the Minotaur hunts. He draws from the sound memories of future encounters, using voices and words that his prey will speak before they die. He knows what you'll say before you say it. But the labyrinth had more tricks than shifting walls and temporal echoes. In one chamber, they encountered a group of people who looked like they'd been trapped for years, or decades. They wore clothing from different eras, spoke different languages, and all had the hollow-eyed look of people who'd heard too many echoes of their own voices. An elderly man in what looked like 1950s formal wear grabbed Theo's arm and whispered urgently in German. A woman in medieval dress kept pointing at his recorder and crossing herself. A teenager in punk rock attire just laughed and laughed, the sound bouncing off the walls until it became a symphony of madness. "Don't listen to them for too long," Alea warned, pulling Theo away from the group. They've been trapped in echo loops, conversations with versions of themselves from different time periods. They can't tell anymore which thoughts are original, and which are just reflections of reflections. "Time doesn't flow linearly here," she explained as they hurried away from the group. "Some of them entered the labyrinth before I was born. Others came after you from your future. The acoustic resonance creates bubbles, pockets where different moments exist simultaneously." They passed through a section where the walls were covered in what looked like ancient recording equipment. Bronze discs covered in spiral grooves, crystalline formations that pulsed with stored sound, and strange mechanical devices that clicked and whirred as they processed acoustic data from across the centuries. Theo recognised the principles behind some of the technology, even if the execution was impossibly advanced for its supposed time period. They were trying to preserve everything, he murmured, running his fingers along one of the bronze discs. Every conversation, every song, every cry for help. But why? "Because sound is the only thing that survives death," came a voice from behind them. They spun around to find an old woman emerging from a side passage, her clothing a patchwork of fabrics from different eras. Unlike the lost souls they'd encountered earlier, her eyes were sharp and focused. "I'm Pythia," she said, though Theo suspected that wasn't her original name. "I was the oracle at Delphi before the gases stopped speaking to me. I've been in the labyrinth longer than anyone. long enough to understand its true purpose. She led them to a small chamber where the walls were covered in what looked like a massive sound map, lines and symbols that traced the acoustic path through the entire maze, with annotations in dozens of different scripts. The builders knew that their civilization would fall, Pythia explained, pointing to symbols that seemed to represent different time periods. They created the labyrinth as a monument to the power of sound, not just to preserve their knowledge, but to prove that voice and memory could transcend the boundaries of life and death. But the sacrificial victims, Aaliyah began, were volunteers, Pythia finished, at least originally, people who chose to enter the labyrinth not to die, but to become part of its eternal symphony. Their voices would join the choir of all who came before, creating a bridge between past and future. Then what went wrong? Theo asked. Pythia's expression darkened. The priests forgot the original purpose. They began using the labyrinth as a weapon instead of a library. The Minotaur mask was created to enforce their power, to turn what should have been a willing transformation into a terrifying execution. The sound memory became corrupted with fear and violence instead of wisdom and continuity. That's when Theo heard something that made his blood freeze, his own voice calling from a passage ahead of them. "Aaliyah! Don't trust the recordings! I'm not who you think I am!" It was definitely his voice, but distorted, desperate, warning them about something that hadn't happened yet. Or maybe it had happened, in a different loop of time, and the echo was just catching up to them now. That's when Theo heard something that made his blood freeze. His own voice calling from a passage ahead of them. "Aaliyah, don't trust the recordings. I'm not who you think I am." It was definitely his voice, but distorted, desperate, warning them about something that hadn't happened yet. Or maybe it had happened, in a different loop of time, and the echo was just catching up to them now. They ran. The three of them ran through passages that seemed to grow more unstable with each step. The walls rippled like water, the floor shifted beneath their feet, and the acoustic properties changed so rapidly that Theo's ears popped from the pressure variations. Behind them, they could hear multiple versions of his own voice calling out warnings, instructions and pleas, all slightly different, all equally desperate. "The labyrinth is trying to reset itself," Pythia gasped as they ran. "When too many temporal loops overlap, it purges the accumulated contradictions. Everyone inside gets scattered across different time periods." "How do we stop it?" Theo shouted over the growing cacophony of overlapping echoes. "You don't stop it," Pythia replied. "You ride it out. But first you need to understand what you're really fighting." They reached a junction where 7 passages met, each one humming with a different harmonic frequency. The walls here were covered with frescoes that seemed to move in the flickering torchlight. Scenes of ancient rituals, astronomical calculations, and figures in bullhead masks performing ceremonies that involved sound manipulation on a massive scale. "The Minotaur isn't just one person," Pythia explained rapidly. "It's a role that's been passed down through generations of priest-acousticians. Each one adds their voice to the collective consciousness stored in the mask. When someone puts it on, they become all the Minotaurs who came before, their knowledge, their hunting skills, their intimate understanding of the labyrinth's acoustic properties." Aaliyah grabbed Theo's arm. "That's why it could use your voice. It had access to all the future conversations you'll have in the labyrinth, across all possible timelines. But it also means," Theo said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn, "that every Minotaur has also been a victim, someone who was trapped here and chose to become the hunter rather than die as prey." The insight hit him like a physical blow. The monster they were fleeing from was just another lost soul, caught in the same temporal trap, forced to play a role that had been defined by centuries of accumulated fear and violence. "The mask is the real prison," he whispered into his recorder. "Not the labyrinth itself, but the expectation that someone has to be the monster." The passages began to loop back on themselves more frequently, and Theo realized they were being herded towards something. From above had grown louder, occasionally in a language that predated Greek. But worse than that were the voices. His own voice, Aaliyah's voice, Pythia's voice, the voices of people they'd never met, calling to them from passages they hadn't explored yet. "The echo chamber," Aaliyah said finally, stopping at an intersection where 5 tunnels met. "We're being drawn toward the echo chamber. That's where it ends." "Where what ends?" "The hunt. Every path eventually leads there. It's where the Minotaur waits." But Pythia shook her head. "Not waits. Where it's born. The echo chamber is where the mask chooses its next wearer. It's been calling you since you first entered the labyrinth, Theo. Your obsession with sound, your ability to navigate by audio alone, you're exactly what it's looking for. Theo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground air. You're saying it wants to turn me into the next Minotaur? I'm saying it needs to. The role can't remain empty for long, or the labyrinth's acoustic systems will collapse entirely. And if that happens, everyone trapped in the time loops will be lost forever, including all the people from your future who will eventually find their way here. They stood at the threshold of the echo chamber, and Theo could hear the previous Minotaur moving around inside, its bronze armour scraping against stone as it paced the perimeter. But now he understood that sound differently. It wasn't the confident stride of a predator. It was the restless movement of someone who was just as trapped as they were. The chamber they entered was perfectly circular, with a domed ceiling that concentrated and amplified every sound. The walls were covered in bronze surfaces polished to mirror brightness, and the floor was carved with a spiral pattern that drew the eye inward toward the centre. The acoustic properties were incredible. A whisper from one side of the room could be heard clearly anywhere else, but the echoes created complex interference patterns that made it impossible to tell where sounds were actually coming from. The Minotaur was waiting for them, not a monster, as Aaliyah had said, but something far more unsettling. A figure in elaborately carved bronze armour and a bullhead mask that gleamed in the torchlight. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Welcome, sound collector," it said, and Theo realised it was using his own voice, words he'd recorded earlier, played back through some acoustic manipulation he couldn't understand. "You've brought me such interesting recordings." The figure moved around the edge of the chamber, always keeping to the shadows, never quite solid enough to pin down. It spoke with the voices of everyone Theo had ever known, his parents, his teachers, his classmates, but the words were wrong, threatening, designed to make him question his own memory. "You can't trust your own recordings," it said in his mother's voice. "Sound lies, especially here. Every echo is a deception." Theo raised his recorder with trembling hands. "Then let me add one more lie to the collection." He played back the very first recording he'd made in the modern cave, his own voice saying, "Sound is the memory of space." But this time, he spoke the words aloud simultaneously, creating a feedback loop between past and present. The effect was devastating. The bronze surfaces around the chamber began to resonate in harmony, creating a standing wave that made the air itself visible. The Minotaur's mask cracked, revealing not a face but an absence, a void where sound went to die. The floor spiral began to glow with phosphorescent light, and the entire chamber started to rotate around its central axis. "Now!" Aaliyah shouted over the growing harmonic resonance. "The portal is opening!" She grabbed Theo's hand and pulled him toward the centre of the spiral. As they ran, Theo could hear other voices joining theirs, the voices of all the people who had ever been trapped in the labyrinth, their final words creating a chorus of liberation that built and built until it became a sound so pure and powerful it seemed to tear reality open. The last thing Theo heard before the silence took him was Alea's voice, crystal clear above the chaos. "Don't forget me." He woke in the modern cave, his recorder warm in his hand and his classmates' voices echoing from the entrance above. According to his phone, only a minute had passed since he'd squeezed through the gap in the concrete barrier. But the recorder told a different story. Hours of audio, impossible conversations, the sound of bronze armour scraping against stone. Theo climbed back toward the surface, his mind reeling with everything he'd experienced. By the time he rejoined the tour group, he'd almost convinced himself it had been a hallucination brought on by oxygen deprivation and too much Mediterranean sun. Almost. But that night in his hotel room, he listened to every minute of recorded audio. It was all there. His conversations with Aaliyah, the sound of the singing passages, the terrifying mimicry of the Minotaur. And at the very end, barely audible beneath the harmonic chaos of their escape, Aaliyah's voice whispering coordinates and what sounded like instructions for finding her. 3 months later, back in Chicago, Theo had turned his recordings into an audio art project. He called it The Labyrinth of Echoes, a Sonic Map of Time, and uploaded it to every platform he could find. The piece was structured as an interactive sound maze. Listeners could follow different audio paths, make choices at sonic intersections, and gradually uncover the story hidden in the recordings. the project took on a life of its own. Audio engineers analysed the impossible acoustic properties recorded in his files. Linguists tried to decode the linear A fragments he'd captured. Physicists debated whether the temporal effects could be explained by some unknown property of crystalline resonance. But for Theo, the most important responses came from a different audience entirely. People who had dreamed of labyrinths. People who had heard echoes in empty buildings that shouldn't have been there. People who had found themselves in underground spaces that weren't on any maps, following sounds that led them deeper into the earth. Most people thought it was an elaborate work of fiction. A few recognised it as something more. The first message came through the project's contact form 2 weeks after he'd uploaded it. I found the coordinates embedded in track 7. There's an entrance in the basement of the Heraklion Archaeological Museum that the staff don't know about. The walls are covered in the same spirals you recorded. Thank you for the map, then another. My grandmother used to sing a lullaby that matches the frequency pattern in your safe passage recordings. She learned it from her grandmother, who claimed it would protect travellers in dark places. I think your Alea isn't the only one who escaped. And another. I work in subway tunnel maintenance. Last month, I found a section of carved stone that shouldn't exist according to any city records. When I played your recordings through the tunnel's PE system, new passages opened up. There are people down there. People who've been missing for years. We're organising a rescue mission. Theo began to understand that the labyrinth wasn't confined to Crete, or even to the ancient world. It was a pattern, an acoustic phenomenon that could manifest anywhere the right conditions existed. Underground spaces with specific geological properties, architectural designs that accidentally recreated the Minoan sound engineering principles, even digital environments where audiophiles could create their own maze-like structures. He started receiving recordings from other people, sound files that captured impossible echoes, voices speaking in temporal loops, the distinctive harmonic resonance of passages that sang with safety or whispered with danger. Each recording added another piece to the growing map of connected spaces, a network of acoustic portals that spanned continents and centuries. 6 months after his return from Greece, Theo had amassed enough evidence to know that Alea and Pythia and all the others weren't just trapped in one ancient maze beneath Knossos. They were part of a vast interconnected system, accessible from dozens of entry points around the world, all leading to the same impossible space where time flowed sideways and sound carried memory across the centuries. But the most significant message arrived on a Tuesday night in March, exactly 1 year after his trip to Crete. I followed your sounds. I found the entrance you described in your coordinates. The girl with the dark hair tied back with leather cords. She's real. She's been waiting. The labyrinth is still there, still active. Others have found it too. We're going in tonight to bring her home. Thank you for leaving breadcrumbs for the rest of us who know how to listen. The message was signed with coordinates, not for Greece, but for a location in the subway tunnels beneath New York City. Theo stared at the message for a long time, then pulled out his recorder and pressed the red button. "This is Theo Anastos, sound archaeologist," he whispered into the device. "If you're hearing this, it means you found the audio map I left behind. The labyrinth is real. The girl trapped inside is real. And if you're brave enough to follow the echoes back to their source, you might be able to help her. But remember, in a place where time loops and space folds in on itself, the only way to navigate is by trusting the sounds that sing true. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is leave a message for yourself to find later, when your memory fails and all you have left are the echoes of who you used to be." He paused, listening to the familiar hum of his apartment's heating system, the distant sound of traffic, the normal acoustic environment of a world where echoes behaved predictably. Then he continued, "But I've learned something else since I've been back. The labyrinth isn't just a place, it's a state of being. We're all navigating mazes of sound and memory, following echoes of our past selves, leaving traces for our future selves to find. The difference is that most of us never learn to listen carefully enough to hear the patterns. We miss the songs that would guide us safely through the dangerous passages of our own lives." He uploaded the new recording to his project and sat back in his chair, watching the city lights twinkle beyond his window. Somewhere out there, in subway tunnels and basement archives and forgotten underground spaces, people were following the sound maps he'd created. Some would find Alea and the others, some would get lost themselves, but all of them would add their voices to the growing chorus of people who who understood that sound was more than just vibration in the air. It was the medium through which consciousness could transcend the boundaries of space and time. As he prepared for bed, Theo could have sworn he heard, carried on the wind that rattled his windows, the faint echo of bronze armour scraping against stone, and a girl's voice calling his name across an impossible distance. But now, instead of fear, the sounds filled him with a strange sense of peace. He was no longer trapped in the labyrinth, but he was still connected to it, part of the vast network of sound and memory that linked all the lost souls who had learned to navigate by echo and resonance. And sometimes, late at night when the city was quiet enough, he could hear them all singing together, the voices of the past and future joining in a harmony that transformed the entire world into one enormous labyrinth of sound, where every echo was a message, every silence was a choice, and every recording was a breadcrumb trail left for someone else to follow home. He uploaded the new recording to his project and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Outside his window, the city hummed with its usual nighttime symphony of traffic and air conditioners and distant sirens. Normal sounds from a normal world where time moved forward and echoes faded and mazes were just puzzles to be solved. But sometimes, when the wind hit his building just right, Theo could swear he heard drums beating in an ancient rhythm, and a girl's voice calling his name across an impossible distance, reminding him that some labyrinths exist not in space, but in time, and that the most important paths are the ones we forge with sound itself. The obsidian mirror had always given Jalen the creeps, even when La Abuela was alive to tell him stories about it. Now, 3 weeks after her funeral, it sat wrapped in that same jaguar-patterned cloth on his bedroom dresser, catching the afternoon light filtering through his East LA apartment window. His father had insisted he take it. "She wanted you to have it, mijo," but Jalen couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching him back. At 15, Jalen Reyes had bigger problems than creepy antiques. His Spanish was getting rusty despite his father's constant corrections, his grades were slipping, and he felt caught between worlds, too Mexican for some kids at school, not Mexican enough for others. The mirror seemed to embody that same uncomfortable in-between feeling, its obsidian surface reflecting his face in ways that made his features look strange, unfamiliar. The crack running down its centre didn't help. When Jalen held it up to examine the damage, the fissure seemed to pulse, as if the mirror were breathing. Sometimes, when the light hit it just right, he could swear he saw smoke curling up from the crack's depths. Heat mirages, he told himself. Los Angeles in September was still brutal. The day everything changed started like any other, except for the rare solar eclipse that had dominated the news for weeks. Schools were closed, eclipse glasses were sold out everywhere, and his father had left work early to drive up to Griffith Observatory with some friends. Jalen had begged off, claiming he wanted to finish organising La Abuela's things in the attic. The truth was he needed space to think, and something about the approaching eclipse made him restless. He climbed the narrow stairs to the cramped attic space above their apartment, cardboard boxes stacked around him like ancient monuments. La Abuela's life reduced to photographs, letters, and mysterious objects she'd never fully explained. The mirror drew his attention again, unwrapped and gleaming dully in the dim light filtering through the small window. As the eclipse began outside, the attic grew darker despite the afternoon hour. Jalen found himself staring into the obsidian surface, tracing the crack with his finger. The mirror felt warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been in the cool attic air. He pressed his palm against it, feeling the stone pulse like a heartbeat. That's when he cut himself. Later, he'd never be sure if the mirror's edge was sharper than he'd expected, or if something had pulled his hand down onto it with deliberate force. Either way, blood welled from his palm and dripped directly into the crack. The moment his blood touched the obsidian, everything changed. The mirror began to breathe, not metaphorically, but with actual visible movement, expanding and contracting like living tissue. The crack widened, and from its depths came not smoke, but something that looked like liquid shadow. The attic around him started to warp, walls bending inward as if reality itself were being pulled toward the mirror's surface. Through the growing distortion, Jalen saw impossible things. A massive stepped pyramid rising toward a blood-red sky, priests in elaborate feathered headdresses chanting around smoking braziers, and crowds of people dressed in ways he'd only seen in textbooks about pre-Columbian civilizations. The vision felt more real than the attic, more solid than the boxes surrounding him. As the eclipse reached totality outside, the mirror's pull became irresistible. Jalen felt himself falling forward, not down but into the obsidian surface, through layers of liquid darkness that felt like diving into warm blood. The last thing he heard was his father's voice calling his name from somewhere impossibly far away. He woke to the sound of drums and thousands of voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. Spanish and English evaporated from his mind, replaced by flowing syllables that felt familiar on his tongue. Nahuatl, though he'd never learned a word of it. The knowledge came with the certainty of a dream remembered upon waking. Jalen opened his eyes to find himself lying at the base of the most magnificent structure he'd ever seen. The pyramid from his vision rose before him, but in daylight it was even more breathtaking and terrifying. Each level was carved with serpents, jaguars, and human figures in various poses of worship and agony. At its peak, smoke rose from what could only be an altar. The crowd that had gathered around him fell silent as he sat up. Hundreds of faces stared at him with expressions ranging from awe to terror. His modern clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a Lakers t-shirt, marked him as clearly foreign as if he'd been glowing. But instead of hostility, he saw recognition in their eyes, as if they'd been expecting him. An elderly man pushed through the crowd, his elaborate headdress marking him as someone important. He wore a cloak covered in obsidian mirrors that caught the sunlight and threw it back in dazzling patterns. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. Tezcatlipoca has sent his child to us. The time of the sixth sun approaches. Before Jalen could protest that he wasn't anyone's child and had no idea what a sixth sun meant, the crowd erupted in celebration. Flowers rained down on him, and hands reached out to touch his clothes, his skin, his hair. Through the cacophony he heard whispered prayers in Nahuatl, words that his inexplicably expanded vocabulary translated. Lord of the smoking mirror, he who is by the shoulder, bringer of change, the high priest, for that's what the man clearly was, helped him to his feet with surprising gentleness. I am Lakalel, he said, guardian of the sacred fires. You have come to us in the time of the fifth sun's ending, just as the prophecies foretold. The sun grows weak, and soon it will die, unless we feed it properly. Jalen wanted to explain about the mirror, about 2025, about how this had to be some kind of hallucination brought on by blood loss or shock. Instead, he found himself nodding and allowing Tlacaelel to lead him through the streets of what he now realized was Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire, in what felt impossibly like the year 1486. The city was alive in ways that defied description. Canals crisscrossed between elaborate stone buildings, filled with canoes carrying goods and people. Gardens bloomed on rooftops and in courtyards, creating a riot of colour against the white limestone architecture. The air smelled of copal incense, cooking meat, and the green scent of abundant water. It was beautiful and alien and completely, utterly real. They brought him to the palace, where servants bathed him and dressed him in clothes befitting his supposed divine status. A cloak made from the feathers of hundreds of birds, sandals decorated with precious stones, and around his neck a pendant made from polished obsidian that felt warm against his chest. When he looked at his reflection in the polished bronze mirrors they provided, he barely recognized himself. Over the following days, Jalen learned the terrifying truth of his situation. The Aztecs believed they lived in the age of the fifth sun, the fifth world cycle in their cosmology. The previous four suns had ended in destruction, by jaguars, wind, fire, and flood respectively. The fifth sun, they believed, would end in earthquake and famine, unless they could appease the gods with sufficient offerings. Human offerings. The first time Jalen witnessed a sacrifice, he barely made it to the edge of the temple platform before vomiting. The casual efficiency with which the priest cut out the victim's heart, the way the crowd cheered as blood poured down the pyramid steps, the matter-of-fact disposal of the body, it all felt like being trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. But what disturbed him most was how the sun never seemed to set that day. From morning until what should have been night, it hung overhead, burning with an intensity that made his skin prickle even in shade. People whispered that it was watching him, waiting for his next move. Children pointed and said the sun smiled when he walked by. It was during those endless daylight hours that he met Citlali. She was about his age, with intelligent dark eyes and a sceptical expression that set her apart from the reverent faces that usually surrounded him. She served in the temple as a keeper of the sacred calendar, which meant she could read and write, rare skills, especially for a woman. More importantly, she was one of the few people who seemed willing to question the priest's interpretation of his arrival. "You're not a god," she said bluntly during one of their conversations, spoken in Nahuatl but somehow perfectly clear to him. Gods don't look confused when people pray to them. They don't flinch during sacrifices, and they definitely don't ask what year it is. Citlali became his teacher, helping him navigate the complex world of Aztec society while keeping his growing doubts and fears hidden from the priests. She taught him more Nahuatl, explained the intricate calendar system, and helped him understand the political currents that ran beneath Tenochtitlan's religious facade. Most importantly, she believed his story about coming from the future, though she interpreted it through her own cultural framework. "Perhaps you are from the sixth sun," she mused one evening as they walked along one of the quieter canals. "Perhaps Tezcatlipoca sent you back to learn what must be done when our world ends." It was Citlali who first suggested they explore the forbidden areas beneath the main temple. The tunnels and chambers carved into the rock foundation were older than the current structure, remnants of earlier buildings and possibly earlier civilizations. Armed with torches and her detailed knowledge of the temple's layout, they descended into the darkness. What they found in the deepest chamber made Jalen's blood run cold. Carved into the walls were names and messages in English, Spanish and other languages he recognized. Michael Chen, 1847. Sarah Williams, 1923. "You can't leave. The sun eats liars. The mirror shows only death." In the centre of the chamber sat an obsidian disc the size of a manhole cover, its surface perfect and uncracked. Unlike his grandmother's small mirror, this one seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When Jalen approached, he could see movement in its depths, shadows that looked like people reaching toward the surface as if trying to escape. Hidden beneath the disc, wrapped in oiled cloth, they found a collection of bark paper codices covered in Aztec pictographs. Citlali's education proved invaluable as she translated the ancient text. What they learned made escape seem both possible and terrifyingly dangerous. The mirrors were part of an ancient time seal, created by priests of an earlier age, who sought to commune with the gods across the barriers of time. But something had gone wrong. Instead of allowing communication, the mirrors had become traps, pulling people from different eras and different places into this single moment in 1486. The trapped souls were used to feed the dying fifth sun, their life force extending its existence far beyond its natural span. The only way to return home was to perform a specific ritual during a solar eclipse, offering a piece of oneself to break the seal. But the next eclipse wasn't for 3 days, and Tlacaelel had already announced that Jalen would be the centerpiece of a grand sacrifice to welcome the sixth sun. "He doesn't want a new sun," Citlali whispered as they read the codex by torchlight. "He wants to keep this one alive forever, even if it means feeding it every soul that gets pulled through the mirrors." Time was running short, and the cosmic forces acting on Jalen were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The sun followed him wherever he went, never setting, never dimming, its heat growing more intense each day. In reflective surfaces, polished bronze, still water, even the obsidian pendant around his neck. He caught glimpses of his modern world, his father's worried face, his own empty bedroom, the shattered remains of his grandmother's mirror. The dream started on the second night. In them, he stood before Tezcatlipoca himself, the smoking mirror god who appeared as a massive jaguar with stars for eyes and obsidian claws that reflected infinite versions of reality. The god spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "Give me your eye, and I will let you see home. Give me your heart, and I will let you return. Give me your life, and I will let you live." Jalen always woke from these dreams with tears streaming down his face, though he wasn't sure if they were from sadness or terror. On the morning of the third day, Tlacaelel came to Jalen's chambers with an honor guard and a terrible smile. "The time has come," he announced, "for Tezcatlipoca's child to fulfill his purpose. Tonight, as the sun dies and is reborn, your sacrifice will ensure that darkness never comes to our world." But Citlali was ready. She had spent the previous day preparing an escape route through the canal system, that would allow them to reach a smaller temple on the outskirts of the city, one dedicated to moon ceremonies, where the large obsidian disc could work its power without interference from the main temple's protective wards. Their escape began in darkness, the first true night Jalen had seen since arriving in 1486. As they slipped through the water-filled tunnels beneath the city, carrying the heavy obsidian disc between them, Jalen felt a mixture of hope and dread. The eclipse was only hours away, and with it, his chance to return home. But the ritual required a personal sacrifice, and he still didn't understand what form that would take. They reached the moon temple just as the eclipse began. The smaller pyramid was older and cruder than the grand structures of central Tenochtitlan, its stone darker and carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. It was a circular chamber open to the sky, with a stone altar positioned to catch the light of celestial events. Jalen placed the obsidian disc on the altar as the moon began to pass in front of the sun. The disc immediately began to pulse with internal light, and in its depths he could see the shadowy figures of all the trapped souls more clearly. They were reaching toward him, mouths open in silent screams of warning or pleading. The ritual required blood, but more than that, it required understanding. As Jalen read the incantations carved around the chamber's rim, he realized what his grandmother had tried to tell him through stories he'd dismissed as folklore. The mirrors weren't just magical artifacts, they were pieces of a god's consciousness, scattered across time and space. To use them was to invite that consciousness into yourself, to become a bridge between worlds. But bridges could be crossed in both directions. As the eclipse reached totality, Jalen pressed his palm to the obsidian surface and spoke the words Sitlali had helped him memorize. I am the child of two worlds, born of the fifth sun but belonging to another. I offer my sight to see truth, my blood to seal the path, my will to break the chains that bind souls to this dying light. The disc flared with impossible brilliance, and suddenly Jalen could see everything, past, present and future spreading out before him like a vast web of possibility. He saw the Spanish conquistadors who would arrive in just over 30 years, bringing plague and violence that would shatter this world forever. He saw the people who had been pulled through time by the mirrors, confused, terrified souls from different eras who had become unwilling fuel for Tlacaelel's obsession with extending the fifth sun's existence. Most clearly he saw the price of return. One eye offered to Tezcatlipoca as payment for passage between worlds. Not metaphorical vision, but literal sight, a piece of himself that would remain forever connected to this place and time. Jalen pressed his left eye against the obsidian surface, feeling it burn and then go numb as something essential was drawn out of him. The disc absorbed his sacrifice with a sound like breaking glass, and suddenly he could see the path home opening before him, a tunnel of swirling darkness that led back to his own time. But freedom came with a price he hadn't anticipated. Tlacaelel had followed them, bringing temple guards and the fury of a priest whose grand plan was collapsing. As Jalen prepared to step through the portal, the high priest grabbed Kitlali, an obsidian knife pressed to her throat. You will not destroy what I have built, Tlacaelel snarled. The fifth sun will continue, fed by the blood of believers and unbelievers alike. Choose, child of Tezcatlipoca, your escape or her life. The choice tore Jalen apart. Sitlali had risked everything to help him, had believed in him when no one else would question the priest's interpretation of his arrival, but he could feel the portal beginning to close, his one chance at returning home slipping away with each passing second. Sitlali made the decision for him. With a cry of defiance, she drove her elbow into Tlacaelel's stomach and broke free from his grip. But the high priest recovered quickly, lunging toward the obsidian disc with his ceremonial knife raised high, intent on shattering it and trapping them all in 1486 forever. Jalen reacted without thinking. He grabbed Tlacaelel as the man attacked the disc, and together they tumbled into the swirling portal. For a moment that felt like eternity, all three of them, Jalen, Sitlali and the high priest, were suspended in the space between worlds, between times, between one reality and another. Then something went wrong. The disc cracked under the strain of supporting three people's passage, and the portal began to collapse. Jalen saw Kitlali's face, beautiful and terrified, as she was pulled away from him by currents of time he couldn't fight. Tlacaelel screamed as he was caught between the closing passage his form stretching and distorting until he became nothing more than a shadow trapped in the mirror's depth. Jalen fell through darkness and silence, his consciousness fragmenting as reality reassembled itself around him. The last thing he saw before losing himself completely was his father's face, lined with worry and exhaustion, leaning over a hospital bed. He woke up in Cedars Sinai Medical Center 3 days after the eclipse, his father asleep in the chair beside his bed. The doctors told a story about finding him unconscious in the attic, apparently having suffered some kind of seizure. There were questions about the eye injury, a perfect circle of damaged tissue that would never heal, requiring surgery to remove what remained of his left eye. The obsidian mirror lay in pieces on the hospital room's windowsill, its surface shattered beyond repair. When the nurses asked about it, his father explained that it had been found beside Jalen, apparently broken in his fall. They assumed it was somehow connected to his injury, but Jalen knew better. In the fragments of obsidian, when the light hit them just right, he could see shadows moving. Sometimes they looked like the trapped souls he'd left behind in 1486. Sometimes they looked like Kitlali, reaching toward him across the barriers of time with an expression of desperate hope. Recovery was slow and complicated. The eye patch drew stares and questions he couldn't answer honestly. How could he explain that he'd lost his eye to an Aztec god in exchange for passage through time, that he'd witnessed human sacrifice in Tenochtitlan and learned to speak a dead language through supernatural means, that he'd fallen in love with a girl who had lived and died 5 centuries before his birth? The dreams never stopped. Every night Jalen found himself back in the temple chambers, listening to the drums and the chanting, feeling the heat of that endless sun on his skin. Sometimes he dreamed of Kitlali, and in those dreams she was always trying to tell him something important, something he could never quite remember upon waking. His relationship with his father grew complicated. The man was grateful to have his son back, but he could see that something fundamental had changed. Jalen spoke differently now, with occasional words in a language that sounded like Spanish but wasn't quite. He knew things about Mexican history and culture that he'd never studied, details too specific and personal to have come from textbooks. Most disturbing were the moments when Jalen would stop mid-conversation, staring at nothing, his remaining eye unfocused. During these episodes he would whisper names in Nahuatl, or trace symbols in the air with his fingers, or speak directly to someone who wasn't there. When asked about it later, he never remembered what had happened. The broken pieces of the obsidian mirror became a source of both comfort and torment. Jalen kept them in a wooden box his father had made, taking them out only when he was alone. In their fractured surfaces, he could sometimes see glimpses of his other life. Tenochtitlan's canals reflecting the morning sun, the elaborate feathered costumes of priests and nobles, the face of a girl who had believed in him when belief meant risking everything. But most often, he saw himself as he really was now, a 15-year-old boy caught between worlds, marked by an experience that had changed him in ways he was still discovering. The eye patch was just the visible sign of a deeper transformation. He had touched something ancient and terrible and beautiful, and it had left its mark on his soul. 6 months after his return, Jalen began to notice other changes. His remaining eye could see things that shouldn't be visible, heat signatures of people who had died, shadows that moved independently of their casters, reflections that showed the past instead of the present. The boundary between his world and others had become permanently blurred. Sometimes in mirrors and shop windows and the surface of still water, he saw Chitlali. She looked exactly as she had in 1486, but her surroundings were different. Sometimes she appeared to be in a modern city, sometimes in landscapes that existed nowhere on Earth. She was still trying to reach him, still trying to communicate something vital across the impossible distance between their realities. The sun outside never looked quite right anymore. Even through his remaining eye, it appeared somehow diminished, as if part of its light were being siphoned away to feed something in another time and place. During eclipses, and there were several that year, Jalen felt the pull of the broken portal, a whispered invitation to step through shadows and find his way back to a world that was gone. He resisted, but the temptation grew stronger with each passing month. In his dreams, Tezcatlipoca still spoke to him, offering bargains and promises that sounded more reasonable each time he heard them. "Give me your other eye," God whispered, "and I will show you how to reach her. Give me your heart, and I will make you whole. Give me your life, and I will let you truly live." But Jalen had learned something during his time in 1486, something the priests and their bloody rituals had never understood. The gods needed human choice to have power. Every sacrifice had to be willing, every offering freely given. His grandmother's mirror had called to him across time not because he was chosen by destiny, but because he had chosen to answer. Now he faced a different choice. He could live safely in 2025, marked but whole, carrying the memories of another world like scars that would never fully heal. Or he could step back through the cracks between times, sacrificing his place in the modern world for a chance to find Citlali and discover what had become of the souls trapped in Tlacaelel's eternal fifth son. Standing in his East LA bedroom, holding the fragments of his grandmother's mirror while his father called him down to dinner, Jalen Reyes made his decision. But that choice, and its consequences, belonged to another story, one that would begin the next time an eclipse darkened the sky, and the obsidian whispered his name through the spaces between seconds. The mirror reflected nothing now but broken light, and the face of a boy who had learned that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed. In his remaining eye burned the knowledge of what he had seen, what he had lost, and what he might yet find if he was brave enough to pay the price the gods demanded. But for now he wrapped the mirror fragments in their jaguar-patterned cloth and went downstairs to share a meal with his father, carrying the weight of two worlds in his chest like a heart that beat in temporal rhythms no doctor could ever understand. Miles Foster had always been drawn to places that time forgot. Not the romantic, ivy-covered ruins that appeared on Instagram feeds, but the raw, honest decay of abandoned shopping malls, defunct restaurants, and boarded-up roller rinks. At 17, he'd already documented over 300 forgotten locations across Los Angeles, each one telling a story of dreams deferred and time's relentless march forward. His YouTube channel, Urban Archaeology, had a modest following of fellow explorers and nostalgia enthusiasts who appreciated his respectful approach to documenting decay. Miles never vandalized or stole. He was a historian of the discarded, not a destroyer. His videos were quiet contemplations on impermanence, set to ambient music he composed himself on vintage synthesizers he'd rescued from thrift stores. The Skate Galaxy roller rink had been on his list for months. Sealed behind chain-link fencing and corrugated metal barriers, it squatted like a wounded beast in the shadow of a freeway overpass. Built in 1972 and shuttered in 1987, it had become the subject of urban legends among local skaters and paranormal enthusiasts. Some claimed to have heard disco music emanating from within on summer nights. Others swore they'd seen flashing lights through gaps in the boarded windows. Miles didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in the power of places to hold echoes of their former glory. That's what drew him through the gap he'd discovered behind the loading dock, past rusted no trespassing signs, and into the stale darkness of the rink's interior. His flashlight beam swept across a landscape of devastation and memory. The main skating floor stretched before him, its once glossy wood now warped and split, colonized by weeds that had somehow found purchase in the gaps between boards. Graffiti covered every available surface, not the artistic kind he admired in abandoned subway tunnels, but the desperate scrawls of kids who'd broken in for drinking parties or drug deals. The disco ball still hung from its chain above the centre of the rink, tarnished and pocked with missing mirror tiles. Concession stands lined one wall, their menu boards still visible beneath layers of dust and spiderwebs. Nachos, $1.50. Coke, 75 cents. Prices from an era when $1 could still buy something meaningful. Miles laced up his roller skates, vintage 1970s Chicago plates he'd found at an estate sale, and pushed off onto the uneven surface. The wheels caught on every crack and gap, but there was something magical about gliding through this ghost of entertainment past. He imagined the place in its heyday. Hundreds of skaters moving in synchronized circles, disco lights painting rainbow patterns on the walls, the air thick with excitement and aquanet. His camera captured everything as he narrated in his characteristic whisper. The wood flooring shows classic signs of deferred maintenance, probably dating back to the early 80s when business started declining. You can see where the snack bar's neon signs were removed, leaving perfect rectangular shadows on the walls like ghosts of commerce past. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the rumble of freeway traffic overhead. A rhythmic thumping, like a bass line coming from somewhere beneath the floor. Miles stopped skating and held his breath, straining to isolate the sound. There it was again. Not just bass, but voices too, distorted and hollow, as if filtered through layers of wood and time. The rational part of his mind suggested settling foundations or echoes from the apartments next door, but urban exploration had taught him to trust his instincts. Strange sounds in abandoned places often led to interesting discoveries. Hidden rooms, forgotten storage areas, architectural secrets. He skated harder, following the sound as it seemed to move beneath his wheels. The faster he went, the louder it became, until it resolved into something unmistakably musical. Disco. The irony wasn't lost on him. A disco song playing in an abandoned disco-era roller rink. Someone was either playing an elaborate prank or the stories about this place were more than mere legend. Miles was pushing toward the centre of the rink, directly beneath the disco ball, when the world fell out from under him. The floor didn't crack or splinter. It simply wasn't there anymore, as if reality had developed a sudden gap. He plunged through darkness that seemed to stretch forever, his stomach lurching with the sensation of freefall. His last coherent thought before unconsciousness claimed him was that this was a hell of a way to die while making a YouTube video. He awoke to the sensation of smooth wood against his cheek and the overwhelming smell of floor wax and popcorn. His body ached as if he'd fallen down a flight of stairs, but nothing felt broken. Groaning, he pushed himself up and immediately froze. The skate galaxy surrounded him, but it wasn't the ruin he'd entered. Pristine hardwood gleamed beneath banks of coloured lights that pulsed in time with music that was definitely not coming from his imagination. The disco ball above him was whole and spinning, casting moving constellations across walls that were bright with fresh paint and promotional posters. Disco Revival Weekend, August 12th to 14th, 1977, proclaimed a banner stretched across the entrance. Below it, teenagers in bell-bottoms and platform shoes glided in perfect formation around the rink's perimeter, their movements choreographed by years of practice and the infectious rhythm of the Bee Gees. Miles scrambled to his feet, his vintage skates feeling suddenly authentic rather than retro. His 21st century clothes, dark jeans, band t-shirt and hoodie, marked him as clearly as if he'd worn a sign reading "Not from here." Several skaters had already noticed him, their curious gazes lingering on his smartphone as he reflexively checked it for the time. The screen was black. He pressed the power button repeatedly, but nothing happened. When he held it up to the light, he could see hairline cracks across the internal display, as if it had been struck by lightning from the inside out. Panic began to set in as the impossibility of his situation crystallized. This wasn't a movie set or some elaborate historical recreation. The sounds were too authentic, the smells too specific, the casual interactions between people too unstudied. Somehow, impossibly, he was in 1977. He stumbled toward the exit, desperate for air and space to think. Outside, Los Angeles stretched before him in a form he'd only seen in movies and old photographs. The cars were different, angular sedans and muscle cars instead of the hybrid compact vehicles he was accustomed to. The fashion was different. Even the air seemed different, hazier with smog but somehow more alive with possibility. The payphone outside the rink caught his attention. In his time it had been a charred, blackened monument to urban decay. Now it gleamed with fresh paint, its booth clean and well-maintained. He approached it cautiously, fishing for change in his pockets, before remembering that modern coins might not work in 1977 technology. But the phone wasn't waiting for coins. The handset was hot to the touch, and the metal surface around the dial was discoloured, as if it had been subjected to intense heat. When he looked closer, he could see that the burn pattern was fresh, the metal still warm, the plastic still soft at the edges. A newspaper vendor on the corner was calling out headlines that confirmed his worst fears and deepest hopes simultaneously. Blackout warning for weekend! Power grid unstable! The date on the papers was August 12th, 1977, the same date advertised inside the rink. Miles bought a paper with one of the few old coins in his collection, a 1976 bicentennial quarter he'd carried as a good luck charm. The vendor, a grizzled man in a Dodgers cap, looked at him strangely, but accepted the money. The paper's front page spoke of an expected power grid failure, rolling blackouts planned for the weekend as the city's electrical infrastructure struggled with unprecedented demand during a heatwave. Technical language filled the article, but Miles caught references to unusual electromagnetic activity and unexplained power surges throughout the metropolitan area. On page 3, buried beneath ads for disco albums and roller skating lessons, a small item caught his eye: local youth missing after electrical storm. The brief article described Tommy Valdez, age 16, who had disappeared from the Moonbeam roller rink in Pasadena following a power outage the previous month. No trace had been found despite extensive searches. The boy's friends claimed he had been skating when the lights went out, and when emergency power was restored, he was simply gone. Miles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Tommy Valdez wasn't the first, and if Miles didn't figure out how to get home, he wouldn't be the last. "You look lost, kid." The voice belonged to a janitor emerging from the side entrance of Skate Galaxy, pushing a cart loaded with cleaning supplies. He was perhaps 40 years old, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of moustache that was required by law in 1977. His grey jumpsuit was immaculate, and he wore sunglasses despite the growing darkness. "I'm fine," Miles lied, folding the newspaper defensively. "Just getting some air." "Air's free," the janitor agreed, "but breathing it in the wrong decade can get expensive real quick." He studied Miles with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. "Name's Reggie, by the way. I clean things up around here, all kinds of messes." The casual mention of decades sent ice water through Miles's veins. "What did you say?" "I said you fell into the wrong groove, kid." Reggie's smile was knowing and sad at the same time. "Happens more than you'd think, especially around places like this. Old buildings hold on to things. Sound, light, electricity. Sometimes they hold on to people too." Miles stared at him, trying to determine if this was an elaborate prank or if he'd finally encountered someone who understood what was happening to him. "You're saying you believe I'm from another time? Believe's got nothing to do with it. I can smell the ozone on you, kid. That burnt wire scent that comes from getting too close to a time hole." Reggie parked his cart and leaned against it casually. "Question is, do you want out? Or are you planning to stick around and see how the 70s treat you?" "Out. Definitely out. How do I get out?" Reggie glanced around conspiratorially, then gestured for Miles to follow him. They walked away from the rink's main entrance, past the burned payphone toward the darker side streets where neon signs buzzed with electric life. Time's like music, see? It's got a rhythm, a beat. Most folks, they stay in tempo their whole lives, one beat after another until the song ends. But sometimes there's a skip in the record, a moment where the needle jumps and you end up in the wrong measure. Reggie pointed to the payphone as they passed it. "That there's a marker. Every time hole leaves a scorch when it seals up. The electricity has to go somewhere, and usually it grounds itself in metal." They walked several blocks, Reggie pointing out details that Miles would never have noticed. A streetlight with a black scorch mark at its base. A fire hydrant with discoloured metal around its connections. A mailbox with a pattern of heat damage that looked almost like a fingerprint. "They're all over the city if you know how to look," Reggie continued. "Most folks just see random damage, vandalism maybe, but they're markers, breadcrumbs left behind by people who've slipped through cracks in time." "How many people?" Miles asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "More than you'd think. Less than there should be." Reggie's tone grew sombre. "Most of them never find their way home. They get stuck like you." Reggie stopped walking and turned to face him. Behind the sunglasses, his eyes were older than his face suggested, carrying a weight that spoke of years lost and opportunities missed. "I came from 1989, he said quietly. "Fell through during the Northridge earthquake. Well, the first one. The one that didn't make the history books because it happened in 1977 instead. Time's funny that way. Sometimes it rearranges itself to accommodate the impossible." Miles felt the ground shift beneath his feet, though he couldn't tell if it was physical or metaphysical. "You've been stuck here for 12 years. More or less. Time moves different when you're between whens. I've aged maybe 5 years in 12, which sounds like a good deal until you realise you're watching the world you knew disappear one day at a time." Reggie resumed walking, his pace more urgent now. "But that's my story. Yours is still being written." They had reached a residential area where Spanish-style houses sat behind walls of bougainvillea and chain link. Reggie stopped before a particularly run-down home with a CB radio antenna rising from its roof like a metallic tree. "Friend of mine," he explained, pulling a walkie-talkie from his belt. "Ham radio operator, monitors all the weird frequencies. If there's a time hole opening up, Bobby'll know about it." The radio crackled to life as Reggie keyed the microphone. "Broken Arrow? "This is Maintenance Man. You got your ears on? Maintenance Man? Jesus, where you been? The airwaves are going crazy tonight. I got reports of electromagnetic disturbances all over the city. Something big's building up." The voice was young, excited, crackling with static. "How big? And where?" "Started about an hour ago. Radio stations are getting interference. CB channels are bleeding into each other, but the strongest signal's coming from Griffith Park, up near the radio tower. Whatever's happening, it's centred there." Reggie released the transmit button and looked at Miles gravely. "That's your exit, kid. If you're going to make it home, that's where you need to be." Miles checked his dead phone reflexively, a gesture that had become meaningless but remained compulsive. "How long do I have?" "The blackout's scheduled to start in about 3 hours. When the power grid goes down and comes back up, that's when the holes open. But they don't stay open long, maybe 10, 15 minutes tops. Miss your window and you're stuck until the next convergence." "When's the next convergence?" Reggie's silence was answer enough. They made their way back toward the commercial district, past disco clubs and late-night diners, where groups of teenagers gathered around cars with their hoods up, showing off engines and stereo systems. Miles felt like an anthropologist observing a lost civilization, except he was the one. "I need different clothes," he realised aloud. His modern outfit was drawing too much attention, marking him as an outsider in ways that could complicate his escape. "Already thought of that," Reggie said, leading him into an all-night laundromat where someone had left a bag of donations for goodwill. "Help yourself, but leave something in exchange." Time travellers got to maintain good karma. Miles traded his hoodie and modern jeans for bell-bottom pants, and a that would have been a Halloween costume in his era but blended perfectly here. The clothes felt like a costume, but they transformed how people looked at him. Instead of curious stares, he received nods of acknowledgement, brief smiles from passing strangers who now saw him as one of their own. "Better," Reggie approved. "Now you look like you belong. That's half the battle in any time period." They commandeered a pair of bicycles from outside a closed shop. Reggie left a $10 bill tucked under one of the seats, explaining that in 1977 that would more than cover the temporary loan. The ride across Los Angeles in the late 70s was like travelling through a living museum. The architecture was familiar but different, the streetlights warmer, the very air thick with possibilities that Miles's generation had never known. Griffith Park at night was a different creature than the daylight version Miles knew. Without the security lighting and maintained trails of the modern era, it felt wilder, more mysterious. They abandoned the bikes at the base of the hiking trail and began the climb toward the radio transmission tower that crowned one of the park's highest peaks. "Tell me about the earthquake," Miles said as they climbed, needing to understand Reggie's story, needing to believe that escape was possible. February 9th, 1971, in my time. February 9th, 1977, in this time. I was documenting earthquake damage for an insurance company, up in the foothills near the San Fernando Valley. Old buildings, you know, the kind that don't meet modern code. Reggie's voice carried the weight of memory. I was in this collapsed department store when the aftershock hit. Next thing I knew, I was standing in the same building, but it was intact, under construction actually. The newspaper said it was 1977. Did you try to get back? Every day for the first year. I studied every earthquake report, monitored every radio frequency, chased every electrical storm from here to San Diego. But the rules are different for each person. Your time hole opened in a skating rink during a power surge. Mine opened during seismic activity. They're not interchangeable. The trail grew steeper as they climbed, and Miles found himself grateful for all the hours he'd spent skating. His legs burned, but they carried him steadily upward through scrub brush and the occasional cluster of palm trees that seemed to exist outside of time entirely. "Why do you help people like me?" Miles asked during a rest stop. "Why not just focus on finding your own way home?" Reggie was quiet for so long that Miles thought he hadn't heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the distant hum of the city below. "Because I had help once. Another traveller older than me, been stuck since the 40s. He taught me the rules, showed me the markers, gave me hope even though he'd given up on himself." Reggie removed his sunglasses and Miles saw eyes that carried decades of accumulated sorrow. His name was Vincent. He died in 1983, my 1983, waiting for a time hole that never opened. But before he died, He made me promise to help others who fell through, said it was the only way to make meaning out of being lost. They resumed climbing, and Miles understood now why Reggie wore sunglasses at night. Not to look cool, but to hide the pain of watching the world move forward without him, of being a ghost in his own life. The radio tower grew larger as they climbed, its red warning lights blinking in steady rhythm against the star-filled sky. Los Angeles spread below them like a circuit board, millions of lights connected by rivers of moving traffic. In 1977, it was smaller, more manageable, but no less beautiful. "There," Reggie said, pointing to a section of the tower's base where the air seemed to shimmer like heat waves. "You see it?" Miles squinted and realized he did see something. A vertical distortion in the atmosphere, barely visible but definitely present. As they watched, it pulsed brighter, and the OEM radio clipped to Reggie's belt began picking up fragments of signals from different stations, all overlapping in an electronic chaos. "It's starting," Reggie said. "The convergence. When the power goes down citywide, that distortion is going to tear open like a zipper. That's your door home, kid." As if summoned by his words, the lights of Los Angeles began to flicker. Not all at once, but in rolling waves as the power grid struggled with demand it couldn't meet. Section by section, neighbourhoods went dark, creating a spreading pattern of darkness punctuated by the emergency lighting of hospitals and fire stations. "How long?" Miles asked, though he could feel the answer in the increasing electromagnetic disturbance around them. His hair was standing on end, and the metal buckles on his borrowed belt were growing warm. Minutes, maybe less. Reggie's radio was now picking up signals from what sounded like different decades. A 1940s big band broadcast overlapping with 1960s rock and roll, all threading through contemporary disco. "Time's getting thin. You need to be ready." Miles approached the base of the tower where the distortion was strongest. Up close, it looked like the air itself was torn, revealing glimpses of something else beyond. Not his time, not yet, but a tunnel of swirling possibility that seemed to extend in both directions through the decades. "Reggie," he said, turning back toward his guide, "come with me. Maybe if we both jump together." "Doesn't work that way." Reggie's smile was sad but genuine. "Each hole is tuned to specific temporal coordinates. Yours leads to 2025. Mine would lead to 1989 if it ever opens again. You can't share the same path home." The lights of the city went out all at once, plunging Los Angeles into darkness broken only by moonlight and the emergency glow of essential services. In that moment of electrical silence, the distortion at the tower's base exploded into visibility, a vertical rent in reality that pulsed with blue-white light and crackled with energy that made Miles's teeth ache. Through the opening he could see fragments of his own time, LED streetlights, the shapes of modern cars, the familiar skyline of contemporary Los Angeles. But the image was unstable, flickering like a television with poor reception. "Go!" Reggie shouted over the increasing electrical roar. "It won't stay open long." Miles hesitated, looking back at the man who had saved him from being lost forever in time. "What about you? Will I ever see you again?" "Maybe," Reggie said. "Time's funny that way. Sometimes it gives you what you need, just not when you expected it." Miles ran toward the time hole, feeling the pull of its energy like a tide drawing him home. As he reached the threshold, he heard sirens in the distance, police or fire department, coming to investigate the electrical disturbance. He had seconds before they arrived. He turned back once more. "Reggie, thank you." But Reggie was already fading into the darkness, disappearing with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible in a time that wasn't his own. Miles stepped into the light. The sensation was like being simultaneously electrocuted and dissolved, every molecule in his body vibrating at frequencies that human nerves weren't designed to process. He felt himself stretched across decades, experiencing glimpses of every year between 1977 and 2025 in rapid succession. The rise and fall of fashion trends, the evolution of technology, the changing face of Los Angeles as it grew and shifted and reinvented itself. Then, abruptly, he was falling again, crashing through familiar darkness back onto the warped and broken floor of the abandoned skate galaxy. The silence was deafening after the electronic chaos of the time hole. No disco music, no voices, no electromagnetic hum, just the distant rumble of freeway traffic and the settling sounds of a building slowly surrendering to decay. His phone buzzed against his leg. the screen lit up, showing the time, 11:47 p.m, the same night he'd entered the rink. According to the device's clock, he'd been gone for exactly 17 minutes. Miles lay on the ruined floor for several minutes, processing the impossibility of what he'd experienced. The logical part of his mind suggested concussion, hallucination, some kind of elaborate psychological break brought on by urban exploration gone wrong. But his borrowed clothes told a different story, as did the lingering taste of ozone in his mouth and the faint burn marks on his fingertips from touching electrically charged surfaces. He stood carefully, testing his body for injuries, and found himself remarkably intact considering his interdimensional adventure. The floor beneath his feet was solid again, showing no sign of the hole that had swallowed him hours or decades earlier. As he prepared to leave, his phone chimed with an email notification. The message had been sitting in his spam folder, overlooked among the usual offers for mail enhancement and cryptocurrency investments. The sender was listed as Reggie at 77.temporal, and the timestamp showed it had been sent in 1989. "Glad you made it out, kid," the message read. "Turns out Vincent was wrong about some things. My door opened after all, just took 38 years longer than expected. Found my way back to 89 last Tuesday. Felt like coming home to find your house has been sold and demolished. But that's time travel for you. Anyway, wanted you to know that helping folks like you was worth the wait. Keep exploring, but watch out for thin spots in reality. They're everywhere if you know how to look. Ride safe. Reggie P.S. Check your back pocket." Miles reached into the back pocket of his borrowed bell-bottoms and found something that shouldn't have existed. A Polaroid photograph that was definitely not there when he'd first put on the pants. The image showed him and Reggie standing together at the base of the radio tower, both smiling despite the impossibility of their situation. On the back, in Reggie's handwriting, proof that the impossible is just Tuesday waiting to happen. Walking home through the streets of modern Los Angeles, Miles felt fundamentally changed by his journey through time. The city looked the same but felt different, layered with the knowledge of all the decades it had lived through, all the people who had walked its streets and left their mark on its collective memory. He thought about Tommy Valdez, the missing boy from the newspaper, and wondered if Tommy had found his way home, or if he was still out there somewhere, lost between the moments. He thought about Vincent, the man from the 1940s who had helped Reggie and died waiting for a door that never opened. He thought about all the other temporal refugees who might be wandering through decades that weren't their own, trying to find their way back to a time when they belonged. The abandoned Skate Galaxy looked different now as Miles passed it on his way home, not just as a relic of the past, but as a way station for travellers moving through the fourth dimension. He made a mental note to research the building's history more thoroughly, to look for patterns in electrical incidents and unexplained disappearances that might indicate other time-hole events. His YouTube channel would never be the same. How could he document abandoned places with the same detached curiosity, now that he knew some of them were portals to other eras? How could he explore urban decay without wondering which locations might be temporally unstable, which forgotten corners of the city might be thin spots where the past and future bled through into the present? But he would keep exploring, because that's who he was. The experience had changed him, but it hadn't fundamentally altered his nature. If anything, it had expanded his understanding of what exploration could mean. He wasn't just documenting the physical remains of the past anymore. He was acknowledging the persistence of time itself, the way moments and memories could become embedded in places like fossilized amber. 3 weeks later, Miles was editing a video about an abandoned shopping mall when he noticed something in the background footage that made his blood run cold. In the corner of the frame, visible for just a few seconds as his camera panned across the empty food court, a figure in a grey jumpsuit was mopping the floor that hadn't been maintained in 15 years. The figure looked up at the camera, smiled, and tipped an invisible hat before fading from view. Miles rewound the footage and watched it again, but the figure was gone. No trace remained except the memory of recognition, and the growing certainty that his adventures in time were far from over. Some places, he was learning, existed outside the normal flow of temporal causality. Some people became unstuck from their proper decades and learned to navigate the spaces between moments, and some stories, once begun, echoed forward and backward through time until their endings became their beginnings, and their beginnings became their endings. Miles saved his video file and began planning his next exploration. this time armed with the electromagnetic field detectors and a deeper understanding of the thin places where time wore through, like fabric stretched too tight. If there were others out there, lost between the decades, maybe he could help them find their way home. After all, someone had helped him. The disco ball in the abandoned skate galaxy spun one more time in the darkness, its broken mirrors catching light that shouldn't have existed, casting fragments of past and future across walls that had seen both the rise and fall of dreams. In the silence that followed, a radio somewhere in the building picked up the faint signal of a song that had been popular in 1977, playing just long enough for anyone listening to remember that time, like music, always finds a way to repeat its most beautiful refrains. 6 months after his return from 1977, Miles had developed a routine that would have seemed obsessive to anyone who didn't understand the weight of his secret knowledge. Every evening after school, he would visit the abandoned payphone outside Skate Galaxy, checking for new burn marks or electromagnetic anomalies. He carried a digital EMF detector now, a device that had become as essential to his urban exploration kit as his camera and flashlight. The payphone had become his barometer for temporal instability. Some days it registered normal background radiation. Other days, usually during electrical storms or periods of high solar activity, the readings would spike into ranges that his research suggested were impossible for standard telecommunications equipment. His YouTube channel had evolved too. While he still documented abandoned places, his videos now included subtle references to temporal archaeology, the study of how time itself could become layered and compressed in forgotten locations. His subscriber count had grown steadily as viewers picked up on the unique perspective he brought to urban exploration, though none of them suspected the true source of his insights. The comments section had become a fascinating repository of stories from people who claimed to have experienced their own temporal anomalies. Most were probably fantasies or misremembered dreams, but a few carried the ring of truth that Miles had learned to recognize. A woman in Detroit who swore she'd spent an afternoon in 1965 after falling through the floor of an abandoned Motown recording studio. A man in Chicago who claimed to have witnessed the Great Fire of 1871 while exploring the basement of a building that supposedly predated the disaster. Miles began corresponding with these people privately, sharing just enough of his own experience to encourage them to tell their full stories. Slowly, he was assembling a database of potential timehole incidents, mapping them against historical electrical disturbances, seismic activity, and periods of high electromagnetic radiation. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying. Timeholes weren't random. They clustered around specific types of locations and seemed to be increasing in frequency. Places where human emotion had reached peak intensity, roller rinks, dance halls, music venues, sports stadiums, buildings that had hosted gatherings of people experiencing joy, excitement, or transcendence together, seemed particularly susceptible to temporal instability. His research had attracted the attention of Dr. Sarah Chen, a physics professor at UCLA who specialized in quantum mechanics and temporal theory. She'd reached out after watching one of his videos that discussed electromagnetic anomalies in abandoned buildings, intrigued by his unexpectedly sophisticated understanding of time dilation effects. Their first coffee meeting had been awkward. Miles couldn't tell her the truth about his experience, but Dr. Chen seemed to sense that his interest in temporal mechanics went beyond mere curiosity. "You know," she'd said, stirring her latte thoughtfully, "there are theoretical frameworks that suggest time isn't as linear as we assume. Quantum mechanics already shows us that particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously. Who's to say larger systems, including conscious observers, can't experience similar non-linear phenomena under the right conditions?" Miles had nearly choked on his coffee. What kind of conditions? High-energy electromagnetic fields, for one. Locations where the local space-time fabric has been stressed by repeated emotional events, what some researchers call psychic imprinting. Places where the boundary between consciousness and physical reality becomes permeable. Dr. Chen had leaned forward conspiratorially. "Of course, this is all highly speculative. The university would probably revoke my tenure if they knew I was discussing temporal displacement theory with a high school student." "What if it wasn't just theory?" Miles had asked carefully. "What if someone had actually experienced something like this?" Dr. Chen had studied him for a long moment, her expression shifting from academic interest to something more personal. "Then I'd say that person had been given an extraordinary gift and an extraordinary responsibility. knowledge of temporal mechanics could be incredibly dangerous in the wrong hands. Their collaboration had deepened over the months that followed. Dr. Chen provided the theoretical framework for understanding time-hole mechanics, while Miles contributed field observations and his growing database of potential incidents. Together, they developed equipment capable of detecting the electromagnetic signatures that preceded temporal disruptions. The breakthrough came during a summer thunderstorm that lit up Los Angeles with spectacular displays of lightning. Miles was monitoring the abandoned skate galaxy when his equipment registered readings unlike anything he'd recorded before. The electromagnetic field around the building was fluctuating in patterns that matched theoretical models for space-time distortion. He called Dr. Chen immediately. "It's happening again. The readings are off the charts." "I'm on my way," she replied, and Miles could hear her car door slamming in the background. "Don't go inside without me. If you're right about this place, we need to approach it scientifically." They arrived at the rink together, Doctor. Chen carrying a suitcase full of monitoring equipment that made Miles's EMF detector look like a toy. As they set up their instruments, the storm intensified overhead, each lightning strike seeming to charge the air around them with additional energy. "There," Dr. Chen said, pointing to her laptop screen where wave-like patterns scrolled past in real time. "Do you see how the field is oscillating? It's creating standing waves in the local space-time continuum. If my calculations are correct, those oscillations should begin to synchronize in approximately..." She checked her watch. 3 minutes. Miles felt the familiar tingling sensation that had preceded his original journey through time. His hair was standing on end, and the metal fixtures on the building were beginning to glow with St. Elmo's fire. "Dr. Chen," he said carefully, "what happens when the oscillations synchronize? Theoretically, the standing waves should collapse into a stable temporal aperture, a doorway through time." She looked up from her instruments, her eyes bright with scientific excitement. "Miles, we might be about to witness the first documented instance of controlled temporal displacement." The air above the payphone began to shimmer, just as it had at the radio tower 6 months earlier. But this time, instead of the chaotic energy of an uncontrolled time hole, the distortion formed with geometric precision, a perfect oval of swirling light that pulsed in rhythm with the storm overhead. Through the aperture, Miles could see glimpses of Skate Galaxy in its 1977 heyday. Disco lights flashed in sequence, and he could hear the faint sound of music drifting through the temporal barrier. "Incredible," Dr. Chen whispered, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard as she recorded everything. "The energy requirements for this should be astronomical, but the storm is providing a natural power source. It's as if the building has learned to channel lightning into temporal mechanics." That's when they saw him. Reggie emerged from the temporal aperture like a man stepping through a doorway, his grey jumpsuit and familiar moustache unchanged from Miles's memory. He looked around at the modern world with the expression of someone returning home after a long journey. "Evening, kid," he said to Miles, as if 6 months and 48 years were merely the space between heartbeats. "Figured it was time we had a proper conversation." Dr. Chen stared at him in academic fascination. "You're from the past, an actual temporal displacement subject." 1977, originally, though I've been making the rounds lately, 1963, 1984, 2003. Time travel gets easier once you learn the rhythms. Reggie approached their equipment setup with professional interest. "Dr. Chen, I presume? Miles has told me a lot about you." "When did Miles tell you about me?" Dr. Chen asked, then immediately answered her own question. "Temporal mechanics. You've been meeting across multiple time streams." "Smart lady. Yeah, Miles and I have been having conversations that haven't happened yet from your perspective. That's how I knew to show up tonight." Reggie smiled at Miles's confusion. "Don't worry, kid. You'll understand when you're older or younger. Time travel makes verb tenses irrelevant." The storm was intensifying, and the temporal aperture was beginning to pulse more rapidly. Dr. Chen's instruments were registering energy levels that defied conventional physics. "We don't have long," Reggie said urgently. "The aperture will collapse when the storm passes, but before it does, there's something you both need to know. The time holes aren't random, and they're not just natural phenomena. Someone's been creating them." Miles felt cold despite the warm summer air. "Creating them? Who?" "That's what we need to find out, but the pattern is clear once you know what to look for. Every major time hole incident corresponds to moments when someone desperately needed to escape their current timeline. Tommy Valdez in 1977, his father was abusive and he was planning to run away the night he disappeared. Vincent in the 1940s, he was about to be shipped overseas to a war he didn't believe in. Me, in 1989. I just lost my job and my wife had left me. Dr. Chen was taking notes rapidly. You're suggesting that temporal displacement is triggered by extreme emotional distress combined with environmental factors. Not just triggered, guided. There's an intelligence behind it, something that responds to human suffering by offering escape routes through time. Reggie's expression grew troubled. But escape isn't the same as solution. Most of the people who fall through time holes never learn to navigate temporal mechanics. They get stuck, like I was, or they fragment across multiple timelines until they lose coherence entirely. The lightning was striking closer now, and with each flash the temporal aperture grew more unstable. Through it, Miles could see that the 1977 version of Skate Galaxy was filling with people. Teenagers in period clothing who seemed unaware that they were being observed from the future. There's more, Reggie continued, his voice barely audible over the thunder. The intelligence that creates time holes isn't human. It's something else. Something that exists outside normal temporal causality. And it's been getting stronger. What does it want? Miles asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. I think it feeds on temporal displacement energy. Every person who falls through a time hole, every moment of chronological disruption, makes it more powerful. And lately it's been creating time holes faster than ever before. Dr. Chen looked up from her instruments, her face pale with understanding. The increasing frequency of anomalous events, the reports you've been collecting, Miles, they're not isolated incidents, they're part of a pattern. The storm reached its peak intensity, and the temporal aperture began to contract. Reggie stepped backward, preparing to return to whichever timeline had become his current home. Find the source, he called to them as the aperture shrank. Find what's creating the holes, and stop it before it fragments reality entirely. And Miles, learn to control your ability. You're not just a victim of temporal displacement, you're becoming something more. The aperture collapsed with a sound like reality tearing, leaving Miles and Dr. Chen standing in the sudden silence that follows a storm. The electromagnetic readings on their instruments returned to normal levels, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Did that actually occur? Dr. Chen asked quietly. Or are we both experiencing some kind of shared hallucination? Miles held up his phone, which had automatically recorded the entire encounter. The video clearly showed Reggie emerging from the temporal aperture, their conversation, and his departure. But more importantly, it showed the precise technical readings from Dr. Chen's instruments throughout the event. It was real, Miles said. And if Reggie's right about someone or something creating these time holes deliberately, then we have work to do. Over the following weeks, they expanded their research with new urgency. Dr. Chen obtained funding for what she described as a theoretical study of electromagnetic anomalies in urban environments, while Miles used his YouTube channel to crowdsource reports of temporal experiences from around the world. The pattern Reggie had identified became undeniable once they knew what to look for. Every documented time hole incident occurred during moments of peak emotional distress, but the environmental triggers were becoming more sophisticated. What had once required powerful storms or seismic activity now seemed to happen during routine electrical fluctuations. Their breakthrough came when Miles discovered that his own temporal sensitivity had evolved since his return from 1977. He could now perceive approaching time holes hours or even days before they opened, experiencing them as a subtle displacement in his perception of time. Conversations would seem to slow down or speed up, and digital clocks would occasionally display impossible times. You're developing temporal synesthesia, Dr. Chen explained during one of their regular meetings. Your brain is learning to process fourth-dimensional information through your existing sensory pathways. It's unprecedented. Miles was less interested in the scientific explanation than in the practical applications. His enhanced perception had allowed them to predict and monitor 3 time-hole events, documenting the process more thoroughly than ever before. Each incident revealed new details about the intelligence behind the phenomenon. The entity, they had begun calling it the Temporal Shepherd, seemed to be learning from each interaction. The time holes it created were becoming more stable, more precisely targeted, and more difficult to resist for people experiencing emotional crisis. It's evolving, Doctor, Chen observed after reviewing their latest data. Each time hole event provides it with more information about human psychology and temporal mechanics. At this rate, it will soon be capable of creating targeted displacements, pulling specific individuals out of their timelines at will. The implications were staggering. An entity capable of manipulating human history by selectively removing or displacing key individuals could reshape reality according to its own incomprehensible agenda. Their investigation reached a critical point when Miles's temporal sensitivity detected the strongest anomaly yet, centered not on an abandoned building or historical site, but on his own high school. The reading suggested that a major time-hole event was building, one that would dwarf anything they had previously documented. "It's targeting you specifically, Doctor," Chen realized as they reviewed the data. "The temporal shepherd has been studying you since your first displacement. It wants to understand how you developed the ability to navigate time holes consciously." Miles felt a chill of recognition. His enhanced temporal perception was showing him glimpses of what was coming, fragments of possible futures where he was pulled across multiple timelines simultaneously, his consciousness scattered across decades like light through a prism. "When?" he asked. "Tonight, during the homecoming dance." Miles had planned to skip the dance, but now he understood why his temporal sensitivity had been pulling him toward the school all week. The temporal shepherd was using the concentrated emotional energy of hundreds of teenagers, joy, excitement, heartbreak, anticipation, as fuel for its most ambitious time hole yet. They arrived at the school to find the gymnasium transformed into a glittering wonderland of lights and decorations. Students moved across the dance floor in elaborate formal wear, their laughter and conversation creating a symphony of human connection that made the air itself seem to vibrate with possibility. Miles's temporal sensitivity was screaming warnings now. The very fabric of space-time around the school was becoming unstable, warping under the influence of whatever force was building toward manifestation. "There," Dr. Chen said, pointing to the corner of the gymnasium where the air was beginning to shimmer. "It's starting." But this time hole was different from the others. Instead of a single aperture, multiple temporal rifts were opening simultaneously, each one showing glimpses of different eras. Miles could see the school's gymnasium as it had been in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1980s, and what appeared to be several possible futures. Students were beginning to notice the anomaly, their dancing slowing as they stared at the impossible sight of their own school existing in multiple time periods at once. "Everyone needs to evacuate," Dr. Chen said urgently. "If those rifts destabilize completely, they could create a temporal cascade that fragments this entire area across multiple timelines." But even as she spoke, Miles realized evacuation wouldn't be enough. The temporal shepherd had learned too much from their previous encounters. It was no longer content to create simple escape routes for individuals in distress. It was attempting something far more ambitious. Through his enhanced temporal perception, Miles could sense the entity's true purpose. It wasn't feeding on temporal displacement energy for its own sake. It was trying to repair something, some fundamental damage to the structure of time itself that could only be healed by gathering enough chronological disruption energy. The morning fog clung to London streets like a guilty secret, and Eli Morgan pulled his hard hat lower as he approached the skeletal remains of the old textile factory. At 34, he'd seen enough construction sites to know when a building was dying, and this Victorian monument was gasping its last breath. The developers wanted it gutted and transformed into luxury flats, but Eli found himself drawn to the history trapped in its sooty bricks. For weeks now, the dreams had been getting worse. Black smoke filling his lungs, soot-covered hands reaching out from darkness, the terrible sound of collapsing steel and screaming voices. He'd wake up choking, his sheets drenched in sweat, tasting coal dust on his tongue. It made no sense. He'd never worked in a mine, never been inside this particular factory before the restoration job began. The rest of his crew wouldn't arrive for another hour, giving him time to inspect the towering smokestack that dominated the building's eastern wall. The structure was a marvel of 19th century engineering, rising nearly 200 feet into the grey sky. Today he needed to assess its stability before they began demolition on the surrounding workshops. Inside the base of the chimney, Eli's flashlight beam danced across the interior walls. What he saw made him pause. Strange markings covered the ancient brickwork, initials carved deep into mortar, handprints pressed into soot-darkened surfaces, names scratched with desperate fingernails. He read aloud, running his fingers over the letters T. Whitlock. The name seemed to echo in the hollow space above him. As he stepped closer to examine the markings, the floor beneath his feet gave way with a sickening crack. Eli plunged downward into darkness, his last conscious thought the taste of coal dust filling his mouth and the sound of his own scream disappearing into the shaft above. When consciousness returned, it came with the acrid smell of coal smoke and the distant clang of metal on metal. Eli's eyes watered as he struggled to sit up, coughing black soot from his lungs. But something was wrong. The air itself felt different, thicker, more oppressive. The quality of light filtering down from above had changed from the clean, fluorescent glow of modern London to something dimmer, more yellow. He stumbled out of the narrow alley beside the smokestack and onto a street he didn't recognise. The cobblestones were slick with something that might have been mud but smelled like industrial waste. Horse-drawn carts clattered past, their wheels throwing up sprays of filth. Men in threadbare clothes and women in long, dark dresses hurried by without meeting his eyes. The buildings around him were the same Victorian structures he'd been working on, but they looked new, their bricks sharp-edged and red, their windows gleaming despite the perpetual haze that seemed to hang over everything. "You there?" a rough voice cut through his confusion. Two men in blue uniforms approached, truncheons already in hand. "What's your business lurking about in private property?" Before Eli could answer, a woman's voice interrupted. "Officers, please, this man is my brother. He's been ill, working the night shift at the foundry. I've been looking everywhere for him." The woman who stepped between Eli and the constables was perhaps 40, with greying hair tucked under a worn bonnet and hands red and raw from hard labour. Her eyes, though kind, held the weight of someone who had seen too much suffering. "That's so, Martha." One of the officers eyed Eli suspiciously. "Funny how your brother's clothes don't match the others coming off shift." Martha's grip on Eli's arm tightened. He got himself turned around in the fog, fell into the river trying to find his way home. Look at the state of him. She gestured to Eli's modern work clothes, now torn and stained with soot and what he hoped was just mud. The constables exchanged glances but seemed satisfied. As they moved on, Martha hurried Eli down a narrow side street. "Don't know what game you're playing, stranger, but you've got the look of someone running from trouble. Name's Martha Briggs, and I lost my real brother to the cholera 3 years past. But these streets eat men alive, and I won't see another soul taken if I can help it." Her small room above a bakery was sparse but clean, with a single window that looked out over a maze of factory smokestacks. As Martha bustled about preparing a meal of bread and thin soup, Eli tried to process what was happening to him. The woman spoke of cholera and foundries as present realities. The clothes hanging on lines outside the window were straight from a museum display. The very air he breathed tasted of coal smoke and industrial chemicals. "What year is this?" he asked finally. Martha paused in her stirring. "Year?" "It's 1852, near the end of November. What kind of fever have you been running that you'd forget such a thing?" The date hit Eli like a physical blow. Somehow, impossibly, he had fallen not just down a chimney shaft, but through time itself. And if this was truly November 1852, then he knew exactly where he was and what was about to happen. Over the next 2 days, as Martha nursed him back to strength, Eli ventured out into the Industrial Revolution London that surrounded him. The factory he had been restoring in his own time was here in its full, terrible glory. Mortlock Mills dominated several city blocks, its multiple smokestacks belching black clouds into the perpetual grey sky. Children no older than 10 scurried between buildings carrying heavy loads of coal and cotton. The sound of machinery never stopped, a constant grinding roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. Eli found himself drawn to the factory gates at shift changes, watching the parade of hollow-eyed workers streaming in and out. Many were children, their faces prematurely aged by hard labour and coal dust. It was among these young workers that he first spotted Thomas. The boy couldn't have been more than 10, but he moved with the quick, sure steps of someone who had learned to navigate the world's dangers early. His job was chimney sweep, and his clothes were permanently stained black with soot. When Eli saw him helping a smaller child who had stumbled under a heavy load of coal, something in his chest twisted painfully. Thomas reminded him of his own younger brother Danny, who had died in a scaffolding collapse 5 years ago. A death Eli still blamed himself for. "You've been watching us," Thomas said one evening as Eli lingered near the factory gates. "Martha says you're her brother, But you don't talk like the others. You ask strange questions about things everyone knows. Eli knelt to the boy's level. What do you know about the factory? About how safe it is inside? Thomas glanced around nervously before answering. Safe? Nothing in there safe, and says we're lucky to have work at all. But... He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Some talk about sounds coming from the upper levels, creaking and groaning where there shouldn't be any. And Mortlock himself, he's been having meetings with men who come in the night. They bring papers afterward. He always looks pleased with himself. That night, Eli made his way through the twisting alleys that surrounded Mortlock Mills. The factory never truly slept. Night shifts kept the furnaces burning and the machinery running. But there were gaps in the patrol patterns, moments when a careful man could slip inside unnoticed. The interior of the factory was a vision of industrial hell. Massive machines loomed in the darkness like sleeping giants, their metal arms and wheels catching what little light filtered through grimy windows. The air was so thick with cotton fibres and coal dust that breathing felt like drowning. And everywhere, the heat, waves of it rolling off the furnaces in the building's lower levels, making the whole structure feel like the inside of a giant oven. Eli made his way toward the upper catwalks, following half-remembered architectural drawings he'd studied in his own time. If his memory was correct, the disaster would originate in the northeastern section, where a main support beam had been weakened by years of excessive heat and inadequate maintenance. As he climbed the narrow metal stairs, he could feel the entire structure swaying slightly with each step. When he found the beam in question, his heart sank. Even in the dim light, he could see the hairline cracks spreading through the metal. The bolts that held it in place were rusted and loose. Below this beam stretched a vast open floor where hundreds of workers would gather in 4 days' time for the annual Workers' Festival, a rare celebration that Mortlock grudgingly allowed to boost morale. Eli spent hours examining the structural damage, using his modern knowledge of engineering to assess what would be needed to prevent the collapse. It would require skilled welding, proper support materials, and at least a dozen men working together. But even as he planned, he knew the real challenge would be convincing anyone to listen to him. His first attempts at warning people fell on deaf ears. The few workers who would speak to him at all dismissed his concerns as the ravings of someone who had clearly suffered some kind of head injury. When he tried to approach the factory foreman, he was threatened with arrest for interfering with mill operations. Even Martha, despite her kindness, clearly thought he was suffering from some form of madness. It was Thomas who finally offered a different perspective. "You're not mad," the boy said one evening as they sat by the fire in Martha's small room. "Different, yes, but you know things you shouldn't know if you were just another mill worker. The question is whether you're here to help or to make things worse." "Help," Eli said without hesitation. "If I can." Thomas studied his face in the firelight. "Then we'll need proof. Something the adults can't ignore. And we'll need allies. People of Mortlock and his operations." Over the next 2 days, Thomas introduced Eli to a small group of workers who had begun to organize in secret. They met in the basement of an abandoned warehouse, speaking in whispers about fair wages and safe working conditions. Their leader was a man named James Fletcher, whose own son had lost 3 fingers to a poorly maintained cutting machine. "You're asking us to risk everything on the word of a stranger," Fletcher said, after Eli had explained his concerns about the factory's structural integrity. "If we're caught interfering with mill property, we'll all be in prison or worse. And if we do nothing, 214 people will die in 3 days," Eli replied, "including children." It was the specific number that finally convinced them. Eli's certainty, his detailed knowledge of exactly where and how the collapse would occur, suggested either prophetic insight or inside information. Either way, they decided it was worth the risk. The plan they developed was simple but dangerous. They would enter the factory during the night shift change, when security was lightest and the noise of the machinery would cover their work. Using materials salvaged from other construction sites around the city and strengthen the surrounding support structure. Eli would guide the work, drawing on his modern construction experience, while Thomas would serve as lookout and messenger. But as they prepared to put their plan into action, Eli made a disturbing discovery. While scouting the factory's exterior, he overheard a conversation between Mortlock and a man he didn't recognize, conducted in the shadows behind the main building. "The insurance policies are all in order," Mortlock was asking. "Everything's arranged," the stranger replied. "The fire will appear to start from a faulty furnace valve. Complete destruction is guaranteed, and the investigators will find exactly what we want them to find." "And the timing?" "The night after your workers' festival. Let them have their celebration. It will make you appear more sympathetic to the claims investigators. Then we eliminate the evidence and collect the payout." Eli's blood ran cold. Mortlock wasn't just neglecting safety. He was planning to burn down the entire factory for the insurance money. The collapse during the festival would kill hundreds, but those who survived would die in the fire the following night. The scale of the planned disaster was beyond anything Eli had imagined. When he shared this information with the group, their resolve only strengthened. "All the more reason to act," Fletcher said grimly. "If we can prove the mill was deliberately weakened, we can expose Mortlock's entire scheme." The night of their mission, London was shrouded in one of its thickest fogs of the season. The group of 8 men and Thomas slipped through the factory gates like ghosts, their movements masked by the perpetual noise of the machinery. Eli led them to the northeastern section, where the failing beam waited in the darkness above. Working by the light of shielded lanterns, they began the delicate process of reinforcing the structure. Eli guided the placement of salvaged iron beams and steel plates, while the others welded and bolted them into position. The work was back-breaking and dangerous. One spark